Before the first sunlight spills across the dunes, there is a moment when the desert seems to breathe. Wind whispering through the ancient stones as a colossal silhouette waits in the dark. The Great Sphinx, older than kings and older, perhaps, than written history itself, stares east toward a sunrise she has already witnessed 12,000 times. But what if those dawns began long before Egypt was born? This is the story of an impossible monument, carved in an age when the Sahara was lush and rivers flowed where sand now sleeps. We will follow the trail of scientists, dreamers, and dissenters searching for the truth of who carved her and why. And before this journey ends, the answer we uncover will not only rewrite history, it will reveal why her unblinking eyes may still be watching for something that is yet to return. If the Sphinx stood before Egypt, then who carved its face? The desert does something strange when the light fades. Its heat dissolves, and what felt blistering by day becomes almost tender under drifting wind. As the sky deepens into cobalt and the constellations burn through the haze, the Great Sphinx begins to change color. The sun left it the color of sand and dust. The moon turns it blue, a ghostly, dreaming creature, half lion, half man, carved from the heart of the plateau itself. Tourists are gone. Generators hum faintly near the distant road. But out here it is still possible to imagine you have stepped into another age entirely. For 5,000 years, this single face has watched the sunrise. Every morning, its eyes meet the horizon just as the first light spills over the Nile. Yet under the moon, it feels less like a guardian of Egypt and more like a creature exiled from time. An orphan of civilizations both known and forgotten. The nearby pyramids, so crisp in daylight, now vanish into the dark. Only the Sphinx catches the glow, its features soft as breathing. Standing before it, you understand why ancient travelers whispered that it could speak, given the right alignment of stars. Legends have always gathered here like desert sand around its paws. Greek historians thought it represented divine wisdom. Medieval wanderers called it an idol of fallen angels. In the 19th century, when wind and time had buried only the head above the dunes, stories spread across Cairo that an entire body lay asleep beneath the surface. Some called it the oldest monument on Earth. Others said it was the petrified image of a forgotten god. Each version grew a little grander with the telling, as if the truth could never be large enough. What darkened their imaginations was the obvious mismatch between weather and stone. The Sphinx is carved from natural limestone, directly out of the living plateau. Its enclosure plunges 12 meters below the desert floor. The walls of that pit are not smooth. They are rounded, scalloped, eroded in curves. The signature of water, not wind. That quiet detail unsettles every neat timeline built by textbooks. For only water thousands of years ago could have sculpted such contours, and modern Egypt has known nothing but desiccation since long before the pharaohs. When scientists and storytellers stand together here, something fascinating occurs. The poet sees mystery in the Sphinx's expression. The geologist sees diagnosis in its scars. Both notice that its weathering cuts vertically across the rock, not horizontally as desert storms would do. Both wonder how a monument supposedly carved around 2500 BCE, an age of scorching sun and trivial rainfall, could bear the marks of centuries of drenching storms. And in that question lies the tremor that still divides archaeology today. Far beneath the romance, excavation notebooks fill with data. Strata sketches, trench markings, samples of limestone paste. Beneath their calm handwriting, however, pulses a distinct sense of disquiet. If the erosion is from water, then the Sphinx was sculpted not 5,000 years ago, but perhaps 12, twice as old. when North Africa was a lush savanna crossed by rivers. That would place its creation thousands of years before the Kingdom of Egypt existed, before the pyramids, before history had learned to write its name. Imagine what that implies. Somewhere in the late Ice Age, when mammoths still roamed northern valleys and glaciers licked the edges of continents, people here might have carved a lion-faced monument 66 meters long. No tools from that era suggest such precision. No records hint it could have been done. And yet, here it stands, eroded but intact, pushing like a tooth through the gum of the earth, impossible to ignore. The scientific mind resists poetry, but standing at the base of the Sphinx erodes that discipline too. The stone itself seems to hum when wind passes across its weather-scored ribs, time gathered into vibration. You can almost feel its patience, millennia of silence layered into each grain. It has watched the Sahara bloom and die, watched rulers rise, die, and claim it as theirs. Watched tourists flee the midday heat, watched dust bury it again and again. And still it waits, part monument, part question mark. Historians point out that attributing the Sphinx to a lost civilization risks romanticism, but they also admit a subtle anxiety. Our entire understanding of human development relies on this desert obeying the standard clock. If the Sphinx is older, then human ingenuity is older, so ancient that its footprints have all but vanished. Perhaps that is why nights like this feel weighted. Beneath the cooling air, one senses more than stone, one senses memory. For thousands of years, the Sphinx has endured the same solitude. Its nose is gone, its beard scattered, but its eyes still lock on the same horizon where the sun will climb again. The sands creep, swallow, and retreat like tides of an inland sea, and each time they reveal the same expression, calm, slightly amused, almost compassionate, as if it knows more than it will ever tell. Its silence is not emptiness. It is restraint, the measured quiet of something that has seen every version of us and chooses stillness rather than judgment. Tonight, under that immense blue hush, the Sphinx feels alive. Each gust of wind seems to carry the faint rasp of an ancient chisel. Each shadow stretches like a memory of hands long vanished. Perhaps those hands belong to farmers watching thunderstorms sweep the horizon, or to architects of a forgotten epoch who built not for gods, but for eternity itself. Whoever they were, they gave the world a riddle carved in stone, and that riddle still whispers in the moonlight. The next step, for those brave enough to listen, is simple. Forget names and dynasties. Forget what we have been taught. Begin with the stone, the weather, and the question of rain. For in those quiet details, the Sphinx begins to speak, and what it says may change everything we think we know about where humanity truly began. The story of the Sphinx that most people know began not in the sands of Giza, but in the tidy rooms of 19th century classrooms. Archaeology was a young science then, part adventure, part empire, and Egypt seemed the perfect stage upon which Europe could watch itself uncover the past. When explorers brushed away the dunes from the Sphinx's head and the surrounding temples, the picture appeared to fit perfectly into the narrative already forming. The monument faced the pyramids of Khufu and Khafra, its body aligned roughly along the same axis. Its stone and craftsmanship resembled what was thought to be Old Kingdom style. The conclusion followed as effortlessly as the Nile's current. The Sphinx was the work of Khafre, the same ruler whose pyramid rose behind it like a chiseled sun. It was a satisfying explanation, as elegant and monumental as the statue itself. The great lion-bodied guardian guarding the valley temples, the pharaoh's image gazing toward the sunrise, symbolism, geometry, and politics in harmonious synchrony. For decades, almost no one thought to question it. It appeared in every textbook and museum placard, reinforced by repetition until repetition became evidence. The ancient world loves neatness, and scholars love patterns. And so a monument carved in the reign of Khafra fit both like the final piece of a jigsaw puzzle that had already been drawn in. But science, when it slows, can turn into scripture. In the early decades of Egyptology, excavation was often as much performance as precision. The European archaeologists who knelt at the Sphinx's base came to confirm their expectations, not to dismantle them. The thought that something might predate Egypt itself sounded heretical. Where, after all, would that place humanity? The walls of Victorian logic were built high to keep chaos and uncertainty outside. Still, cracks formed quietly. Now and then, an architect or geologist would note how strangely the Sphinx's enclosure curved compared to the crisp lines of nearby tombs. Some observed that the monument appeared older than its supposed companion pyramids because its stone was far more degraded. The assumption remained untouched. Perhaps the builders had used poorer rock. Perhaps desert winds had simply hammered harder here. Plausible, yes, but ultimately circular reasoning. The conclusions protected the premise rather than testing it. Throughout the 20th century, Egyptologists refined their chronology using inscriptions, pottery, and burial records, all securely nested within the known pharaonic lineage. The Sphinx, sadly, lacked inscriptions. Not a single hieroglyph names its builder. It was the silent sibling in a family of loud elders. And because silence yields few grants or headlines, researchers left it in peace. Content that the alignment with Khafra's pyramid sealed the matter. By now, the academic rhythm had hardened. New students inherited the consensus like masonry apprentices repeating their master's cuts. To suggest otherwise risked ridicule and career. So the Sphinx waited, gathering sand and secrecy. Beneath its paws, the stone kept eroding, softens under dew at night, expands, contracts, flakes under relentless sun. Each scar a footnote no one yet wanted to read. Then, during the late 20th century, a few modern voices began to murmur. What if water had shaped these crevices? What if the erosion's rounded curves were not merely wind's doing, but the work of heavy, ancient rainfall? Critics of orthodoxy were cautious. Some smuggled these doubts between conference conversations, aware their questions might be met with the chill of professional exile. But doubt, once seeded, is like moisture. It seeps deeper with every storm. They examined maps of precipitation through millennia, reconstructed climates from pollen and lake sediments, and realized that Egypt had not seen that kind of persistent rain since the tail end of the Ice Age, long before the pharaohs. If these trenches and vertical waves in limestone were indeed carved by water, then the Sphinx had already been ancient when Khafra lived. The soil of certainty began to soften. What made the challenge so provocative is that it betrayed no hostility to Egyptology. The dissenters loved the same monuments as their peers. Their heresy lay in humility, in listening to the stone rather than the inscription. They argued that erosion was a text too, written by climate. And in that unfamiliar language, the Sphinx spoke of clouds, not chisels, of torrential rain, not wind-blown sand. Traditional scholars countered with logic of their own. The structure sits within Khafra's complex. Why would a pharaoh build his temple beside someone else's statue? The argument carried cultural weight, but not geological precision. The dissenters responded, perhaps Khafra did what humans always do, claim the work of those who came before. restoration mistaken for creation, appropriation canonized as authorship. What emerged was not simply a scientific dispute, but a philosophical one. When belief and evidence collide, which one is the true ancestor of knowledge? The consensus had been treated like a monument, solid, enduring, but consensus erodes too. The more researchers looked at the Sphinx's scars, the more those scars seemed to look back, asking questions about humanity's memory and the thinness of our chronologies. As skepticism spread, a few younger archaeologists quietly reopened old reports, tracing maps of the enclosure's depth, recalibrating the patterns of wear. The narrative began to breathe again. Beneath polite conversations at conferences lay a pulse of genuine excitement, the sense that history might be turning in its sleep. Perhaps Egypt's most famous statue had outlived not only empires, but eras, and the true date of its birth might lie in a time when the Nile was no more than a river of storms. The moon still falls on the Sphinx as it always has, but the minds studying it no longer see only the work of a single dynasty. Theirs is a gaze of suspicion and wonder, a recognition that knowledge itself can fossilize if left too long under the same sun. In the end, the question that now stirs in the silence of the desert is not whether Khafra built the Sphinx, but how many centuries of forgotten rain stood between his hands and the chisels that first carved that impossible face. When Dr. Robert Schoch first descended into the Sphinx enclosure in the late 1980s, he felt the way a doctor might feel peering into an ancient patient's open wound. The rock wall before him was not the straight-cut precision of dynastic craftsmanship. It rolled in vertical waves, soft ridges, channels worn smooth like melted candle wax. To Schoch, trained to read stone rather than hieroglyphs, those shapes spoke a language as clear as any inscription. They said one word repeatedly: rain. Schoch was not an archaeologist or a romantic. He came armed with seismographs, hammers, notebooks, and a career built on identifying the geological cycles of erosion, how rock decays under differing climates. Limestone in the Sahara, he knew, weathers horizontally under sand-blown abrasion, etching shallow troughs that march in line with prevailing winds. What he stood before inside the Sphinx trench looked nothing like that. The grooves here plunged downward, their edges rounded, their texture softened by water streaming rather than wind scouring. It was the unmistakable handiwork of rainfall, sheets of it over millennia. But Egypt is rainless, and has been for thousands of years. Every geologic chart confirmed it. To carve these scars would have taken centuries of intense precipitation, the kind last seen when the Sahara was green, a savanna with lakes, and storms sometime around 10 to 12,000 years ago. The thought pressed on him with astonishing implication. If the erosion inside the enclosure truly came from rains, then the Sphinx had to have been exposed during that era, which meant the statue was at least twice as old as the pharaohs believed to own it. At first, Schoch assumed he must have missed something obvious. Perhaps groundwater had seeped upward, or runoff from nearby temples had eroded the walls. He checked directions, sampled mineral salts, measured the angle of slopes. None of it fit. Groundwater leaves crystal efflorescence and honeycomb pits. Absent. Flooding creates horizontal notches. Absent. Only steady rainfall could produce these vertical undulations. When he traced their depth and pattern, he found that weathering cut deepest at the top and less at the base. The typical fingerprint of water descending from above, not rising from below. The stone itself insisted on a prehistoric storm. He shared his findings cautiously, presenting them first to a small circle of colleagues. The reaction was polite disbelief. Egypt's timeline was a cathedral built over a century of scholarship. One did not simply move its cornerstone. Where were the tools, the settlements, the bones of a people capable of shaping a 20-meter-high monument 12,000 years ago. Schoch answered with candor. He did not know. The geology came first. History would have to catch up. In 1991, he joined forces with John Anthony West, an independent researcher who had long suspected the Sphinx's weathering told an older story. Together, they undertook a formal survey involving seismic refraction tests, sending sound waves through rock to detect subsurface layers. The readings showed weathered patterns extending below the monument's paws, concealed by fill and restoration blocks. If those layers matched the surface wear, the entire structure had aged under the same climate, long before dynastic Egypt existed. It was a revelation that turned conferences into battlegrounds. When Schoch presented his results at the Geological Society of America the following year, murmurs filled the hall before his first slide appeared. As he compared the enclosure's curves with those carved by ancient rainfall in other deserts, tension rose like a dust storm. Some geologists nodded grimly, recognizing signatures they'd seen on canyon walls and extinct lake basins. Archaeologists, however, bristled. Redating the Sphinx would drag the whole chronology of Egyptian civilization, with its neatly stacked dynasties, into chaos. Someone muttered, fantasy. Another grumbled, Atlantis. Yet Schoch's demeanor remained clinical. He avoided sensational claims, speaking instead of data sets, depth profiles, hydrological models. The evidence, he insisted, could be scrutinized, replicated, even disproved, but not ignored. Every groove on that limestone was a measurable diary line of rainfall intensity. If the record said the desert once drank storms, then denying it meant denying the rock's memory. After the presentation, debate erupted in the corridors. Newspapers seized on the phrase 12,000-year-old Sphinx, headline writers feeding on cosmic intrigue. Academics groaned at the publicity, which only hardened skepticism. But outside of lecture halls, ordinary people looked at the photographs and saw what he saw: a monument half-eaten by water. From that point onward, the Sphinx stopped being a solved riddle. It became a living argument between stone and scholar. Schoch returned to Giza many times in the following years, walking the enclosure at dawn when light revealed subtle gradients no camera captured. He ran his hand along the deepest fissures, feeling where droplets once flowed. This rock remembers rain, he would tell colleagues. To him, it was like hearing the earth breathe, deep, slow, impossible to fake. Every texture whispered of a world unfamiliar to our current deserts, a time when thunder rolled across green plains and humans, perhaps newly conscious of their own transience, decided to chisel permanence into the plateau. The implications reached far beyond Egypt. If the Sphinx truly dated to that vanished climate, then humanity's timeline had a hidden prelude, an era of organized stonework preceding all written history. That idea eventually earned Schoch both acclaim and ridicule. Visionary, said some. Heretic, said others. But in the stillness of the enclosure, away from newspapers and protocols, his conclusion remained the same. The stone itself bore its testimony. Its grooves curved with the rhythm of ancient storms, and those curves did not lie. Long before the pyramids mirrored the stars, before Khafra's artisans hammered copper chisels into the limestone, the plateau had already met the rain, and out of that lost season, the Sphinx was born. If you could lift the Sahara like a curtain and peer back 12,000 years, the scene beneath would astonish you. The desert we know, an ocean of sand and silence, did not yet exist. In its place stretched a tapestry of lakes, rivers, and grasslands that ran from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea. Storm fronts rolled over hills now, long vanished, and the Nile's waters spilled into a network of tributaries glinting under thick clouds. Herds of gazelle and wild cattle grazed along the high plateaus. Crocodiles swam where caravans now die of thirst. It was a world unrecognizable, yet every grain of sand in the modern Sahara remembers it. Scientists began tracing this lost landscape through the most delicate of fossils, pollen grains trapped in ancient sediments. When cores were drilled deep into old riverbeds, the samples revealed alternating bands of green and dust. Each band was a heartbeat of climate. Centuries of woodland and rain, followed by millennia of drought. That rhythmic pulse, sometimes called the African humid periods, repeats every 20,000 years as the earth tilts and wobbles on its axis. When monsoons strengthened, the Sahara bloomed. When they retreated, it withered back into the kingdom of dunes. The last great greening ended just as the Sphinx's mysterious scars were being carved by water. Satellite images taken by radar that can see through sand now confirm what those tiny grains of pollen suggested. Beneath the dunes lie the ghostly outlines of rivers, channels miles wide, branching like veins across the desert floor toward a long-vanished inland sea. Some run directly under what is modern Giza, connecting it to basins hundreds of kilometers to the west. The Sahara, from orbit, looks less like a wasteland and more like the dried skin of a once living world. These buried rivers match the radiocarbon ages of wetter soils and the isotopic traces of ancient rainfall found in Egyptian limestone. Taken together, they form a vast geologic diary written in mud, pollen, and mineral salts. Shoka's water erosion theory, once ridiculed, began to make curious sense against this background. If torrents truly beat down upon the plateau, they did so in an age when Africa breathed moisture. Picture Giza then, a tableland of shallow lakes and grassy ridges, the air thick with humidity, thunder echoing across the savanna, streams from the western mountains feeding a Nile swollen far beyond its modern banks. No dunes, no barren plateau, but a living landscape unfurling beneath restless clouds. In such a world, carving stone from bedrock was possible not through divine intervention, but through communities of people who had tools, time, and protection from the sun's rage. Archaeologists long dismissed the notion of an advanced culture in that old green Sahara, yet traces keep emerging. Hearths and grinding stones near dried lake beds, fragments of red polished pottery, figurines shaped from river clay. At Nabta Playa, deep in southern Egypt's desert, megalithic circles once aligned with the solstices long before Stonehenge rose. These small and scattered clues whisper of people who watched the skies, mapped seasons, and revered water, the greatest of all gods in their world. If those same people or their descendants wandered north toward Giza as the rains faded, they might have left behind a final act of devotion, a lion-bodied sentinel gazing toward the rising sun, guardian of a paradise about to die. The timeline fits with almost aching poetry. Geological cores show the last era of intense rainfall fading around 10,000 to 9,000 BCE. By then, the Sahara's rivers were shrinking, its grasslands turning to scrub. The people who dwelt there would have watched their lakes retreat and their herds dwindle. Building a monument that could outlast the storm's departure may have been an act not of pride, but of grief. Art born from the awareness of endings. As their world dried, they marked its memory in the most permanent substance they knew. Limestone, carved into a creature that would never need to flee from the sun. To imagine the Sphinx standing in that moist wind is to feel history twist in perspective. We are conditioned to think of Egypt as eternally dry, its gods ruling over dust. Yet the stone's corrosion insists on another Egypt, one drenched and roaring with rain, populated by artisans who knew clouds intimately. This humid vision of antiquity upends every assumption about where civilization first blinked awake. Rivers once too wide to cross are now buried beneath lifeless sand. And the monuments we call ancient might be memorials to the climate that once sustained them. Today, when storms occasionally drift across the plateau and lightning flashes over the pyramids, the air carries a faint, impossible scent of wet earth. For a few brief hours, the desert remembers. In those moments, the Sphinx seems to breathe again, as if it recalls the music of rain striking its flanks. The marks carved by that water are still visible under the modern dust. The same lines that guided Shaka's fingertips and startled a century of certainty. They tie the statue not merely to human builders, but to the pulse of the planet itself. Each scar is a coordinate in deep time, aligning the Sphinx with an era when the Sahara was green, a time when thunderclouds gathered over the very spot where now only silence reigns. The question of who first laid chisel to limestone slides like sand through the fingers of time. With each clue the past reveals, another dissolves. Yet hints survive along the Nile's upper reaches, where ancient lakes have long since dried into dusty halos. There, at a place called Nabta Playa, archaeologists found concentric circles of standing stones, some aligned with the summer solstice sunrise, others marking the procession of bright stars through the night sky. These people lived in the 10th millennium BCE, centuries before Egypt learned to write, and yet they already measured the heavens with precision that startles even modern eyes. Their calendars were not etched on papyrus, but in rock, their mathematics carved in shadows that moved predictably with the seasons. Imagining their world is like breathing an unfamiliar atmosphere. The desert had not advanced this far south yet. Rainfall pooled in shallow basins, and herders followed pastures that grew green after monsoon storms. They were hunter-gatherers sliding toward agriculture, men and women who marked time not by kings, but by the return of constellations. In their night sky, one star pattern dominated the horizon: Leo, the celestial lion. During those ages, as Earth's axis slowly wobbled, the rising of Leo signaled summer's arrival. Its great feline shape must have captivated them, the emblem of strength, safety, and sunlight. When floods threatened or drought returned, the lion above offered a symbol of enduring order. That same symbol appears again and again through all later Egyptian iconography. Every dynasty sculpted lions guarding gateways, painted lion gods driving the sun across heaven, or placed leonine sphinxes along ceremonial avenues. The idea of a lion as protector was already ancient by the time the first hieroglyph was scratched. It whispers of inheritance, a cultural memory handed down from those sky watchers of prehistory. If they could mark solstices at Nabta Playa, could they also have carried their astronomy northward as climates shifted, bringing with them an obsession with the horizon and the rising sun? If so, the Sphinx might be the final, monumental echo of their cosmology. An image of Leo made flesh in limestone, positioned precisely to face the eastern dawn when the age of Leo first began, about 10500 BCE. In that epoch, the pattern of the heavens was different. The spring equinox rose not in Pisces or Aries, but under the paws of Leo. The Nile Valley, growing wetter with each decade, may have drawn the Nabta communities north toward more permanent waters as their grasslands dried. Archaeological traces along the migration route show continuity in pottery design and burial customs, a thread of cultural DNA stretching from desert herders to early farmers of the river. Somewhere along that path, the impulse to mark the sky in stone magnified into ambition. It is not difficult to imagine a gathering of their descendants on the Giza ridge, watching the stars as they once did at Nabta, deciding to shape a guardian that would forever mirror the lion above. The practical challenge would have been immense. Their tools were still of copper and dolerite, mallets and pounding stones, yet they knew how to use the weaknesses within limestone. The softer layers could be scraped away, while the harder ones became natural lines of strength. Each curve of the Sphinx's body follows those layers as if its creators understood the bedrock intimately. They were not artists imposing form upon chaos. They were listeners translating what the rock already wished to become. And in that act of translation lay genius, not a civilization of emperors, but a fraternity of stargazers who saw no boundary between earth and sky. Their language, now extinct, must have blended reverence with geometry. For them, religion and astronomy were identical twins. A lion guardian facing east at equinox sunrise was not simply an idol. It was a coordinate, marking where heaven kissed the earth each day. The Sphinx could have served as both temple and calendar, its gaze fixed upon the point where the sun emerged reborn from darkness. Even today, standing before it at dawn, that alignment still feels deliberate. The light first touches the crown of its head, then slides down the length of its back as if returning life to a sleeping god. Such design betrays intelligence older than dynastic Egypt's bureaucracy, a culture that could measure the slow breathing of the cosmos and immortalize it in stone. Unlike later empires that shouted their names across monuments, these people left no inscriptions. Their statement was silence, an eloquence more enduring than words. They built something that would speak through alignment and erosion, communicating with those who could read the sky rather than the script. The Sphinx may therefore be less a statue than a message, its feline body an equation linking stars, seasons, and the fate of humankind. When we call them mystery builders, we may be doing them a disservice. Their greatest act was not magic, but comprehension. They understood cycles, the rise and fall of floods, the march of stars, the inevitability of change. To carve a lion into the bedrock facing the dawn was to declare confidence that light would always return, that even when memory faded and civilizations perished, the conversation between earth and heaven would continue. In that sense, the Sphinx was never only Egyptian. It was a universal idea translated into timeless form, crafted by the first architects of silence who let the sky itself dictate the blueprint. And after 12,000 years, their stone sentence still stands unbroken, speaking softly to anyone willing to listen. Determining the age of the Sphinx is one of science's most frustrating riddles, precisely because stone keeps its secrets too well. Unlike wood or bone, limestone contains no organic carbon to measure its decay. The monument's colossal body reveals nothing that can be radiocarbon dated. Researchers must instead hunt for clues in the margins, the mortar binding nearby temples, the sediment layering the enclosure floor, the fossils trapped inside its quarried rock. Each hint is like a shard from a shattered clock face, and only by fitting them together can scholars hope to guess how many hours, or millennia, have really passed. When the valley temple beside the Sphinx was excavated, its blocks proved to be carved from the same bedrock his builders cut away from around the statue itself. The fit was almost seamless, as though enormous slices of the plateau had been rearranged like a puzzle. Samples of mortar between those blocks, tested by radiocarbon dating, produced unexpectedly early results, far older than Khafra's reign, suggesting that parts of the temple predated the very dynasty supposed to have built it. The news barely seeped beyond academic reports, yet to those who understood its meaning, it landed like thunder. If the mortar was ancient, The original construction must have been too. Further evidence came from the patterns of the quarry marks. Horizontal grooves on the pyramid blocks stopped suddenly at the Sphinx's enclosure, replaced by deeper vertical gouges that seem to have been cut centuries, even millennia, apart. It is as if two entirely different generations of workers used the same site. The first carving with rough, primeval tools. The second returning much later to patch, alter, and restore. In the Valley Temple, chisel marks overlap in confused layers, a palimpsest of efforts separated by vast stretches of time. To test such suspicions, scientists turn to thermoluminescence, a technique that measures when certain minerals last, felt the heat of the sun or a worker's torch. Core samples drilled from the Sphinx's weathered surfaces indicated exposure to light long before the date of any known Old Kingdom construction. Seismic soundings beneath the statue's paws revealed compacted sediments, natural layers compressed not over centuries, but over tens of millennia. The subsurface told a slower, deeper story than dynastic history allows. Then came the microfossils, limestone forms from marine organisms, their shells pressed into stone when the sea recedes. By analyzing which fossils the quarry layers contained, geologists can estimate erosion rates and environmental shifts since extraction. The weathered outer crust of the Sphinx displayed a pattern of biological dissolution consistent with thousands more years of exposure than the supposedly contemporaneous pyramids nearby. The fossils, in effect, kept a patient record of rain and time, and their tally pointed backward into an age when the Nile's banks still carried the scent of wild marsh. For Egyptologists committed to the traditional timeline, these findings were uncomfortable but not conclusive. They argued that Khafre or his engineers might simply have reused much older stone, recycling ancient blocks into new glory. The deep erosion, they said, could be explained by groundwater seeping upward or by centuries of restoration mishaps. Yet the evidence refused to lie flat. The Sphinx's enclosure acts as its own weather gauge. If the surrounding walls record rains long vanished, then the statue sharing that rock cannot have been sculpted yesterday by comparison. The idea that a pharaoh merely inherited an already venerable monument began to spread. Quiet as desert dust, but persistent as the wind itself. Imagine the scene in Khafre's time through this new lens. The plateau already held the weather-scarred figure of a lion watching the east, half buried in sand but impossible to ignore. Perhaps Khafre, building his pyramid nearby, adopted the guardian as symbol, believing it divine. His workers might have recarved the head to resemble their king, shored up cracks with new masonry, and surrounded the ancient idol with temples built of its own dismantled walls. In doing so, they preserved the relic while claiming it. The act was less creation than possession, a conversation across ages spoken in stone instead of words. Every layer the archaeologists examine bears signs of both making and mending. Tool strikes erasing older strikes, mortar sealing ancient joints, new paint clinging to eroded grain. The Sphinx is not a single sculpture frozen in one moment of time. It is an evolving manuscript written by countless hands. Underneath it all, however, lies the original draft, the first unedited vision of its builders, and their names are dust. Whoever they were, they left no stela, no crypt, no story of stone moved or prayers recited. They vanished before they could sign their work, leaving later dynasties to wonder and us to puzzle endlessly over borrowed masterpieces. The geologic evidence, faint but cumulative, whispers the same conclusion. When Khafre's artisans placed fresh plaster on the Sphinx's flanks, they were already working on a ruin. The lion of limestone had been waiting for centuries, perhaps millennia, before their tools ever rang against it. And so the oldest mystery of Egypt sharpens to a single haunting image. An ancient monument reborn under younger hands, its original creators dissolved into prehistory, their silence now the loudest voice in the Egyptian wind. On the Giza plateau, power and stone have always shared an intimate bond. To own the vast horizon, one had to anchor one's name in limestone and granite. Monuments massive enough to outlast decay, descent, and memory. Khafre understood this instinctively. In the hierarchy of pharaohs, he was a man deeply aware of the shadows cast by legacy. His father Khufu's pyramid had already reached such perfection that no successor could easily surpass it. Yet just to the south, half buried beneath centuries of wind-blown sand, lay a colossal shape that needed only a name. And a ruler with ambition rarely resists an unclaimed god. In his time, the body of the Sphinx may have been eroded but recognizable, its lion's form lying in a trench of its own making. The head, however, might have suffered collapse or serious weathering, its features too softened by centuries of rain and sun to inspire awe. What better gesture of divine union than to carve oneself into the face of an ancient guardian? By reshaping that head into his own likeness, Khafre could sip from the timeless power the monument already commanded. The gesture would declare to the world that he who ruled the living also commanded the ancient forces of creation. Across Egypt, similar acts of appropriation repeated with royal regularity. Temples were stripped of older cartouches and re-inscribed with fresh ones. Statues were re-chiseled, their faces given new noses, sharper jaws, different crowns. To claim what came before was to inherit eternity by craft. It required no deceit, merely determination. Few citizens questioned it. After all, pharaohs were divine by decree. Time itself was expected to serve them. If a monarch restored a fallen deity, it was an act of cosmic balance, an assertion that Mayat, the order of the universe, remained under royal supervision. Around the Sphinx, traces of Khafre's construction blitz still shimmer under layers of restoration. The causeway stretching from his pyramid to the valley temple runs almost straight to the guardian's flank, tying them visually together. The temples built from the very blocks quarried around the Sphinx create the illusion that all were part of one master design. Yet when studied closely, their stones reveal inconsistencies. Some joints are razor-tight, others uneven or filled with later mortar. Tool marks vary from coarse pounding to refined chiseling, a mixture of eras caught in a single envelope of dust. And most damning for the theory of original authorship. Not one inscription from Khafre's reign actually states he built the Sphinx. Ancient graffiti discovered near the monument comes not from the 4th dynasty, but from nearly 1,000 years later, in the time of Thutmose IV, who credited a dream in which the Sphinx promised him kingship. Even he seemed uncertain of its origin, calling it Horus of the Horizon, as if inheriting a god already ancient in his day. Between these eras stretches silence, centuries during which the monument watched dynasties rise and collapse without so much as a new dedication carved upon it. Had Khafre truly commissioned so magnificent a sculpture, surely he would have trumpeted the feat on stelae or temple walls. Instead, his supposed masterpiece stands mute. Modern excavations confirm the presence of rebuilds. Restoration blocks forming the Sphinx's chest and paws bear fine Old Kingdom masonry, while deeper layers reveal rougher, older weathered rock untouched by those masons. It is easy to picture the scene. Khafre directing crews under the desert sun, not to fashion a new idol, but to resurrect one. Sand dunes rolled endlessly down from the west, swallowing the lion's back until only its face protruded. Reshaping that ancient visage and pairing it with new temples allowed Khafra to portray himself as the renewer of order, the savior of sacred memory. The gesture was both religious and political genius. He didn't have to create greatness. He only had to remind the world that it still existed. In later centuries, successive rulers repeated the ritual, patching the stone, painting it in vivid pigments, perhaps repairing damage inflicted by time or by those who feared its watchful gaze. Each generation added its touch, like scribes amending a sacred text whose origin story had long been erased. The result is the layered identity we see today. The body of a prehistoric beast wearing the face of a pharaoh, surrounded by temples whose stones tell conflicting tales. Ownership of history has always been power's most envied treasure. Kings knew it, conquerors practiced it, and even modern nations wrestle with it still. To stamp one's name upon what is older than memory is to pretend that time itself bends to authority. Yet the truth beneath the Sphinx refuses subjugation. The deeper scholars dig, the older it becomes, retreating just beyond the reach of any claim. If the Sphinx was indeed adopted rather than invented, then Khafra's triumph was partly illusion, the glory of restoring what he could never truly possess. But illusions can be as durable as stone. Beneath, the carved headdress that bears his likeness, the canyon walls around the Sphinx continue to whisper the dialect of rain and age, the same elemental language that predated every dynasty. No ruler commands that voice. Khafra's artisans may have faced the guardian anew, but the monument's core belonged to another world, another people entirely. In claiming it, he ensured its survival while simultaneously burying its true origin beneath a mask of kingship. And history, ever obedient to authority, took his word for nearly 5,000 years before daring to question it. Beneath the massive paws of the Sphinx, the air feels curiously still. Even in the daytime, when tourist voices and camel bells echo across the plateau, something about that hollow quiet seems to press upward from the ground itself. A tightness, as if the earth were holding its breath. Legends, of course, have long imagined why. For centuries, the villagers of Giza spoke of hidden tunnels running under the monument, ancient passages leading to secret rooms where the wisdom of the gods was sealed away. Over generations, these whispers swelled into myth, until the Sphinx became more than a guardian of the sand. It became a locked door. The most enduring of these tales tells of a hall of records, a library of the ancients said to contain the knowledge of a forgotten world, the maps of stars, histories of lost continents, prophecies of civilizations yet unborn. Such stories grew grander after the American mystic Edgar Cayce proclaimed, in a trance reading during the 1930s, that survivors of Atlantis had buried their archives beneath the Sphinx before cataclysmic floods destroyed their homeland. It was a myth stitched together from fragments of Plato and esoteric longing. Yet it captured imaginations across oceans. Once a story like that roots itself in the public mind, even cautious scientists feel compelled to check the ground, just in case. Early excavation teams during the 1920s and 1930s found no golden library, but they did find evidence of undiscovered space. Crews led by Emile Barres cleared tons of sand to reach the monument's base and uncovered fissures that seemed unnaturally regular. The openings were swiftly sealed, the reasons never fully explained. As decades passed, technology advanced, while permission to probe more deeply remained elusive. Egypt's Department of Antiquities, mindful of the chaos treasure hunters might unleash, guarded the Sphinx as fiercely as the statue itself. Then, in the 1970s and again in the 1990s, new instruments entered the conversation. Teams from Japan's Waseda University, followed later by American and Egyptian geophysicists, dragged ground-penetrating radar arrays over the enclosure. Each pulse of energy traveled through the rock, echoing differently when it struck solid limestone or empty space. The results were puzzling. Under the paws, particularly the left, appeared anomalous reflections, clusters of geometric voids inconsistent with random cracking. Beneath the body, too, two roughly rectangular cavities showed up on the radar screens. The data offered no clear depth or purpose, but definitely suggested more than unbroken stone. That revelation reignited the romance of myth. Reports leaked, journalists spun tales of secret chambers sealed since the Ice Age. Funding offers arrived from every direction, some from scientific institutions, some from private societies, hoping to prove Casey right. Yet the Egyptian authorities remained unmoved. The Sphinx, they said, had endured enough disruption. Excavation permits were denied, postponed, lost in waves of bureaucracy. Only non-invasive surveys could continue, and for decades they have. Each new generation of equipment returning with the same curious story. Behind the carved lion body, space echoes back where none should exist. What might those cavities be? Geologists remind us that limestone weathers unevenly. Pockets form when water dissolves softer veins. Caves, not crypts. Others note the remarkable precision of certain boundaries, right angles rarely created by nature. Could they be excavation tunnels from earlier restorers, sealed and forgotten? Or perhaps flood shelters dug when the plateau was still racked by seasonal rains, meant to preserve something sacred from a deluge no one could stop. The possibilities hover between science and suspense, neither fully provable nor dismissible. In the early 1990s, one team used seismographs to map vibrations across the enclosure floor. The readings suggested hollow zones roughly 12 meters below, leading westward toward the back of the statue. A pattern too deliberate to be chance. The report concluded, and then the work abruptly ceased. Official explanations spoke of funding gaps. Rumors insisted of politics or interrupted permissions. The desert, ever patient, swallowed the instruments one grain at a time until only speculation remained. Standing today between the paws, where modern tourists pose for photographs, you can almost feel that hidden geometry pulsing beneath the stone, like the faint heartbeat of the planet itself. Whether the mystery rooms hold scrolls, sarcophagi, or only the sighing emptiness of geology hardly matters. What fascinates us is that something unknown still lingers below a monument we thought we had mapped completely. Human curiosity is drawn inevitably to sealed doors, and the Sphinx offers one carved on a mythic scale. At sunset, scientists pack up their radar rigs, data stored in humming laptops that glow ghost blue against the deepening amber. Readouts displayed jagged lines of resonance and silence, hints of space sealed since antiquity. No shouts of discovery, no gold, no Atlantean tablets, just waves bouncing through limestone, whispering in a code as indecipherable as time itself. The desert grows quiet again until only wind moves, sliding like breath through unseen cracks. Under the paws, under 40 centuries of sand and rumor, the instruments hum one last time. Their signals fade back into the stillness. Whatever waits down there, emptiness or revelation, keeps its counsel. And above it all, the Sphinx's smile never changes, guarding, withholding, as if amused that after all our science and dreams, we are still listening for echoes beneath her paws. In the autumn of 1992, a faint electric charge settled over the convention center in San Diego, where the Geological Society of America gathered for its annual meeting. The hall smelled of coffee, printer ink, and anticipation. Scientists often pride themselves on calm reason, But that year the air trembled with the promise of controversy. Word had spread quickly through the corridors. A Boston geologist was about to claim that the Great Sphinx of Giza might be older than civilization itself. The veteran archaeologists dismissed it as sensationalism in a lab coat. The geologists, more curious, sharpened their pencils and waited. When Robert Schoch stepped to the podium, he looked less like a revolutionary and more like a quiet teacher, his slides organized, voice measured. Behind him, the first photograph appeared, the Sphinx's southwestern wall streaked in wave-like depressions. "These are not features of wind erosion," he began. "They resemble rainfall weathering observed in regions that experienced intense, prolonged precipitation." A low stir passed through the room. With a laser pointer, he traced the vertical undulations, explaining how desert abrasion chisels horizontally, while water falls in vertical streams that round the limestone. He spoke of the seismic soundings, showing deeper weathering beneath the surface. The pattern of age extended far below any known Old Kingdom alterations. For 15 minutes, the hall remained disciplined, the kind of silence born from suppressed amazement. Then, during questions, the storm broke. Henry Orand, an archaeologist from Chicago, rose first, his voice sharp. "You present geological features," he said, "but you ignore cultural context. No tools, no settlements, no contemporaneous artifacts support such an early date. You cannot rewrite history based on grooves in a wall." Schoch nodded, acknowledging the concern. "True," he answered, "but the rocks do not speak Egyptian. They speak only geology, and geology says water." Another hand shot up, this time a geomorphologist arguing that capillary moisture and salt exfoliation could mimic rainfall erosion. Schoch countered with comparative photographs from ancient quarries in the eastern desert, untouched by rising groundwater yet still etched by rain long gone. Supporters nodded, scribbling notes. The conference moderators struggled to maintain rhythm as question followed question, scientists straining across disciplinary boundaries that none of them had expected to defend. By the second session, archaeologists had rallied in force. Zahi Hawass, then rising within Egypt's Antiquities Organization, sent a strongly worded statement rejecting the claims as nonsense born of misapplied science. Egyptology, he insisted, was built on evidence tangible and chronological. Inscriptions, style, royal records. To suggest people built the Sphinx thousands of years earlier is to imagine ghosts, not humans. Yet outside those walls, reporters were already writing headlines about an ancient flood that changed everything. The next morning, the debate spilled into hallway conversations, breakfast cafes, and the evening press. Some geologists quietly admitted that Schoch's data were unusually consistent. Rainfall analogs from pre-Saharan lake basins showed identical scalloping. Even skeptics agreed the pattern looked less like wind than they wished. The problem was magnitude. To erode that deeply, rainstorms must have fallen for thousands of years past. A claim threatening not just Egyptian chronology, but the comforting narrative of human progress itself. Underlying the scientific sparring was a more personal tension between disciplines. Archaeology and geology respected one another's tools, but guarded their territories like rival kingdoms. Archaeologists dealt in context, human intention, and cultural continuity. Geologists spoke in pressure, precipitation, and time spans that dwarfed dynasties. The Sphinx became their battlefield, a wedge hammered into the bedrock of both sciences. A structure half rock, half art demanded that each field acknowledge the other's language, and neither side found translation easy. Schoch, exhausted yet exhilarated, walked the exhibit floor between mineral booths that evening, overhearing fragments of debate trail behind him. Maybe Pleistocene rainfall? No corresponding strata. an unprecedented civilization. He understood he had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. Either he was catastrophically wrong, or the Sphinx was thousands of years older than any known monument on Earth. The crowd's skepticism did not unsettle him as much as their fascination. Whatever the judgment, the question had escaped confinement. Within months, journals published rebuttals and counter-rebuttals. One issue of Archaeology ran full-color photos of the enclosure with arrows showing supposed wind streaks. A geological bulletin printed comparative erosion charts backing Schoch's claims. The Internet, still a fledgling place of echoes, relayed their quarrel to a public hungry for wonder. To most readers, it sounded less like academic strife and more like distant thunder. Evidence that even experts could still be surprised by the past. In hindsight, that conference became a hinge moment. It reminded science of its paradox, that progress requires turbulence. The way rainfall renews the ground, it ruins. The Sphinx had awakened conflict by doing what it had always done, challenging those who stared too long into its silence. While one faction saw mere weathering, the other saw the signature of a lost world. The debate remains unresolved, like the drizzle that polished its flanks millennia ago. But in that bright conference hall, as voices rose and folded over each other, it was as if the same elemental forces that once carved the Sphinx had returned in human form. Wind and water, logic and passion, together reshaping the landscape of understanding. When science pauses, mythology is never far behind. The ink was barely dry on the conference transcripts before the word Atlantis began slipping through the cracks of conversation like fine dust through fingers. To the journalists watching from the sidelines, Schoch's suggestion of a far older Sphinx sounded like the missing key to one of humanity's oldest legends. A drowned global civilization whose memory survived only through story. The debate that started as geology now overflowed into cultural imagination. And what poured out was equal parts data and dream. Plato's account of Atlantis, first written in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, tells of a magnificent island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules that perished in a single night of floods and earthquakes. For centuries it had lingered as parable, the arrogance of man punished by nature, a morality tale wrapped in salt water. But to some, it was history misfiled as myth. If the Sphinx bore the wounds of ancient floods, they said, perhaps those riddles of stone were echoes of the same catastrophe that swallowed the Atlanteans. Only a few fragments of evidence were needed for the story to bloom. Shattered temple blocks beneath the sea, seismic scars along continental shelves, archaeological sites that seemed inexplicably advanced for their supposed age. In Japan's southern waters, divers were discovering massive terraced formations at Yonaguni, their sharp steps and right-angled corridors appearing almost architectural. Were they the remnants of a city, or simply the patient geometry of geology? The question split the oceanographic community. Yet the photographs gripped the public imagination. Vast underwater staircases carved in blue light, guardians of a history just beyond reach. Thousands of miles away, in the dusty hills of southeastern Turkey, another revelation surfaced. Göbekli Tepe, stone circles standing before the dawn of agriculture, revealed that people 12,000 years ago had engineered monoliths weighing tons, engraved with foxes, cranes, and serpents. The discovery demolished the assumption that civilization required cities or farming first. It also brought Schoch's hypothesis into sharper focus. If humans could build sacred architecture at Göbekli Tepe when the Sahara still bloomed, why not the Sphinx on a greener Nile? Writers began sketching maps connecting these points like stars in some resurrected constellation. Anatolia to Egypt to lost islands. In the Atlantic, perhaps, they proposed, all were fragments of one prehistoric network. A Bronze Age before bronze, erased by the cataclysm marking the end of the Ice Age. The Younger Dryas period, with its sudden freeze and melt, provided the perfect canvas. Glaciers collapsing, oceans rising more than 100 meters, entire coastal worlds vanishing. Flood myths from Sumer, India, and the Americas lined up like corroborating witnesses. A single narrative seemed to shimmer through them all. Destruction by water, rebirth through survivors. Yet myth, like water, flows wherever it pleases. It can fill every hollow of uncertainty until truth becomes buoyant but unmoored. As historian after historian reminded, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the stones of Giza, stubbornly mute, offer neither inscription nor tool left by any Atlantean hand. The erosion of the Sphinx might tell of rain, but not of ships vanishing beyond the horizon. The corridors beneath Yonaguni might be tectonic fractures. The animal carvings at Göbekli Tepe might be spiritual metaphors, not star charts from a global brotherhood. Still, imagination refuses to let the story die. It breathes where data ends, giving color to silhouettes the hard sciences cannot paint. What gives the myth its strange endurance is not gullibility, but yearning. Beneath the rational layers of our species runs a quiet hunger to believe that brilliance once burned before recorded time, that we are descendants of forgotten architects who knew the language of earth and star alike. The Sphinx, inscrutable as ever, becomes the perfect cipher for this ache. Half beast, half god, older than memory, gazing forever toward the sunrise as if guarding an inheritance we misplaced. In the archives of universities, researchers recalibrate instruments, redate fossils, parse chemical isotopes. In living rooms, readers trace lines across atlases, dreaming of continents that slipped beneath tides. Between them stretches a gulf wide as myth itself. It is here, in this shimmer between skepticism and wonder, that the story of Atlantis continues. Not as history, but as mirror. The legend reflects our desire that humanity's roots run deeper than the cold arithmetic of evolution, that somewhere beneath the ocean or the desert, a record waits proving that genius is older than we dare imagine. Nothing in the stones of the Sphinx either confirms or denies such grandeur. They only remind us that absence does not equal emptiness. It simply marks the limit of what we can presently touch. When we tilt between data and dream, seeking where myth begins and evidence ends, we are tracing the same line the Sphinx guards each dawn. The horizon where what is known meets what might yet rise from the depths. High in the limestone hills of southeastern Turkey, where the wind sighs through thistles and the sun burns white against empty plains. A shepherd once stumbled on stones that curved too neatly to be natural. Beneath his feet lay the hill of Göbekli Tepe, the oldest temple complex ever found, buried deliberately nearly 12,000 years ago. When archaeologists began to excavate its layers in 1995, they uncovered T-shaped pillars rising from circular enclosures, some 5 meters tall, each carved with reliefs of animals that seemed to slink and dance across the stone. There were foxes and boars, birds and serpents, and everywhere, the fierce, elegant swish of lions. Nothing about the discovery fit the accepted script. This was the early Neolithic, a time when humanity was supposed to be huddled in camps of hunters, clinging to survival, millennia away from the architecture of gods. Yet these people had organized labor, artistry, and a concept of ceremony grander than any settlement near it could explain. The The stonework alone required hundreds of tons moved and positioned with mathematical precision. Radiocarbon dates placed it around 9600 BCE, remarkably near the epoch of green Sahara rains that may have shaped the Sphinx. Suddenly, prehistory gained an architecture of its own, and it was startlingly sophisticated. As researchers brushed dust from carvings so sharp they seemed to quiver in sunlight, many saw familiar patterns repeated half a continent away in Egypt's sacred art. The animals of Göbekli Tepe weren't random. They were arranged in constellations and clusters as if recording the sky in zoological code. The same melding of heaven and earth appears later at Giza, where the lion-bodied Sphinx mirrors the constellation Leo at the horizon of dawn. Was this parallel coincidence, or memory migrating across centuries of nomadic song and symbol? In the years following Göbekli Tepe's first publication, archaeologists traced the region's cultural ripples outward. Similar though smaller sanctuaries appeared across southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, slowly evolving into the domesticated communities that would invent agriculture itself. The implication was profound. It was not farming that birthed civilization, but faith in astronomy, the desire to build something enduring enough to greet the stars. And if those builders eventually moved south as climate shifted and the Fertile Crescent began to dry, their tradition could have reached the Nile long before written history began. The notion grows more persuasive when examining geometry. At Göbekli Tepe, the ratio of pillars to circle diameter, roughly 1 to 3.14, anticipates a knowledge of P unusual for the Stone Age. The plan appears to model the heavens. Radiating pillars in circular corridors reflect the sky vault, with central monoliths oriented to particular celestial risings. Egypt's temples follow the same principle centuries later, aligning doorways to the sun's journey or to Orion's belt. Even the symbolic pairing of twin guardians at entries. Two upright, human-shaped stones at Göbekli Tepe. Twin sphinxes flanking pathways in ancient Egypt suggests continuity of ritual imagination. Of course, direct descent is impossible to prove. Thousands of years and cultural breaks separate the Anatolian sanctuaries from the Old Kingdom pyramids. Yet the resemblance in intent, the urge to bind heaven to earth through monument, feels too human, too consistent to ignore. The people who carved lions into the limestone ring of Göbekli Tepe worship the same cosmic drama that later Egyptians painted on papyrus. The sun dying and reborn, the stars hunting across eternities. Their temples faced not inward, but upward. They were built not to house gods, but to mirror them. Some scholars call this the parallel spark theory. The different populations, exposed to the same sky and the same changing climate after the Ice Age, reached similar revelations. Others suspect migration, a chain of travelers following rivers from Anatolia into the Nile Valley, carrying myths and stonecraft with them. Perhaps both are true. Ideas, like seeds, often scatter in many directions at once. When clouds drift north of the Red Sea, they carry the same moisture that once fell on Giza and Anatolia alike. Cultures, too, may have moved within those winds. Standing inside Göbekli Tepe's excavated ring today, you can feel that connective echo. The pillars rise silent as priests, their carved animals frozen mid-stride, their surfaces glowing honey gold at sunset, the same hue that paints the Sphinx. Both places share that peculiar stillness, as if listening for a language we have forgotten, whether through shared ancestry or parallel revelation. The builders of Anatolia and the artisans of Egypt were tuned to the same cosmic frequency, chiseling permanence out of transient earth. The discovery in Turkey does not answer who built the Sphinx, but it stretches the map of possibility farther than scholars once dared. If hunter-gatherers at the dawn of the Holocene could fashion sanctuaries rivaling cathedrals, then the notion of unnamed engineers at Giza 12,000 years ago no longer feels impossible. It becomes instead an open corridor, a migration of ideas carved in stone and silence, leading from the hills of Anatolia to the banks of the Nile. The question, who built the Sphinx, begins to blur into a wider, deeper question, one carried by wind across deserts and millennia. Just how far did the imagination of our forgotten ancestors travel? And how much of their vision still sleeps beneath our feet, waiting to be remembered? The desert had long been the purest observatory on Earth. Each night before electric light and smog dimmed the planets, the sky over the Nile burned with impossible clarity, a map drawn in ink that moved yet never changed its meaning. To the people who lived beneath it, stars were not decorations, but instruments. They marked the flooding of the river, the return of seasons, and the fate of kings. Every gleam carried the weight of a clock tick. And on the plateau of Giza, that cosmic clock appears to have been immortalized in stone. For astronomers studying archaic monuments, orientation is the first language of intention. The Sphinx faces due east, aligned with a precision that defies chance. On each equinox, spring and autumn alike, the rising sun crowns its head and floods the corridor between its paws with light. To later Egyptians, this became a symbol of resurrection. To earlier watchers, it may have been something still grander, a direct conversation between earth and sky. When star charts are rolled backward through time using the mathematics of precession, the slow, graceful wobble of Earth's axis, a remarkable picture emerges. Around 10,500 BCE, the horizon alignment mirrored the moment when the constellation Leo, the great celestial lion, lifted his body from the east exactly where the Sphinx now watches. Coincidence, some say. Yet the repetition across scale, lion below, lion above, feels deliberate, like reflection. The dawn of that epoch marked what astrologers call the Age of Leo, stretching roughly from 10,900 to 8,700 BCE, when the sun rose among the stars of that constellation during the spring equinox. In artistic logic, the Sphinx's massive feline form could be a monument to that age, carved as the sky's reflection on the ground, the world declaring, in stone, that it was aware of the heavens turning. Such cosmic storytelling sits naturally beside what the builders of Göbekli Tepe were doing at precisely the same time, erecting pillars shaped like the sky's bones. The mathematic ingenuity required to capture precession is staggering. The Earth's axial wobble completes a circle roughly every 26,000 years, meaning each constellation appears on the equinox for about 200 years before sliding westward. To have recognized that slow drift would require records spanning generations. Imagine priests or astronomer chiefs noting that a star rose a hair's breadth later than it did in their grandfather's lifetime, then calculating its cycle until the movement became predictable. That is advanced geometry stitched into ritual. We find echoes of this precision in the shafts of the Great Pyramid, which point toward Orion's belt, Sirius, and the circumpolar stars, as though charting a celestial map that includes the Sphinx along its eastern axis. It is tempting to see the entire Giza complex as a scaled mirror of the heavens. Pyramids forming Orion's belt, the Sphinx marking Leo, and the Nile itself corresponding to the gleaming river of the Milky Way. When you stand upon the plateau at night and compare star maps to satellite photos, the overlap is startling. Whether the alignment is exact by design or coincidence, the symbolic harmony between land and sky feels unmistakable. The ancients might not have spoken of as above, so below, yet they built it. Critics argue that patterns arise easily to eyes trained. For them, that the human mind craves alignment even in chaos. But erosion alone cannot erase intent. The east-west symmetry of the Sphinx gives away a mind that thought in straight lines and solstice markers. The monument's equinoctial precision tells us its builders had tools, not necessarily metal, but knowledge, adequate to survey horizons across miles. They saw time not as a line, but as a rotation, a wheel. Setting their lion to face the sunrise locked that awareness into the landscape forever. A compass that would keep true even if every human calendar burned. Consider the experience they offered. At pre-dawn on the spring equinox 12,000 years ago, the eastern sky began to paling. The wind stilled. Desert insects paused. On the horizon, a shape of stars rose. First Regulus, the heart of Leo, then the curve of its mane sweeping upward. The first ray of sunlight slid between the Sphinx's eyes, igniting the face of stone like a mirror catching fire. For those who witnessed it, this must have felt like proof of divine symmetry. The lion of light meeting the lion of earth. A celestial ceremony enacted without words. Only geometry, sunrise, and faith in cycles larger than history. Time, patient as the stars themselves, carried the sky through other constellations. Leo descended beneath the horizon, forgotten by the dynasties that later claimed the image. Yet the Sphinx remains fixed, as though still waiting for the heavens to return to the same position from which it once took inspiration. Everything else in Egypt has aged, shifted, or fallen. The lion keeps his gaze. On quiet nights, when the stars over Cairo pierce the haze, the constellation lifts once more. If you stand in the right place, you can frame both the ancient form and its shining echo together. In that instant, it feels as if the sky itself acknowledges what the builders accomplished ages ago. That stone can remember light. The Sphinx, silent witness to countless dawns, watches its reflection rise again, a reminder that the heavens move, civilizations pass, and yet the conversation between both never truly ends. 12,000 years ago, the planet seemed to tremble in its sleep. The Ice Age was ending, but it did not fade gently into warmth. It lurched. Vast glaciers that had gripped the northern continents for millennia began to collapse, their thawing edges breaking into seas of meltwater that poured toward the equator. The event, now known as the Younger Dryas, unfolded with speed no ancient farmer could have imagined. Within decades, global temperatures rose and fell in whiplash cycles. Rivers leapt their banks, coastlines redrew themselves, and species that had ruled the Ice Age vanished almost overnight. The mammoth, the saber-toothed cat, herds of great wild horses, all gone before the world could learn their names. In sediment cores pulled from the Nile Valley, a thin layer of dark clay marks this upheaval. It is rich in charcoal, silted, minerals, and microscopic shells from an ocean that briefly invaded the delta. Geologists call it a boundary layer, a scar in Earth's diary. To storytellers, it reads as apocalypse. If one could stand on the Giza plateau then, the landscape would hardly resemble the Egypt we know. Storm clouds marched across a sky swollen with moisture. Thunder rolled daily from the Mediterranean, and torrents carved new ravines through the soft limestone hills. The Nile rose hundreds of feet higher than its modern course, driven by glacial runoff from the Ethiopian highlands. It was a world of water, and humans, small, scattered, astonished humans, watched it remake their horizon. Across the globe, those memories hardened into myth. When ancient scribes in Mesopotamia recorded the Epic of Gilgamesh, they described a man warned by the gods of a flood that would erase creation. On the other side of the Fertile Crescent, Hebrew prophets turned the same memory into the story of Noah, the righteous builder of an ark. In India's Vedic hymns, Manu survives a cosmic deluge guided by a divine fish. In the Americas, oral traditions of the Hopi and the Maya recall worlds drowned and reborn. Each tale holds different theology, but the same pulse of truth. Once, the waters came and changed everything. The science aligns with their echoes. Ice core records from Greenland show a sudden spike in melt around 10,900 BCE, followed by a catastrophic freeze, then another rapid warming, a climatic whip that starved forests and drowned plains. One hypothesis even points to a meteor impact, scattering debris into the atmosphere, igniting fires that turned continents to smoke. Sea levels rose more than 100 meters within centuries. For early humans living near coasts that now sleep beneath the Mediterranean or the Arabian Gulf, it would have seemed as if the entire world were sliding beneath the sea. If the Sphinx belongs to that epoch, its purpose takes on a tragic grandeur. Imagine carving a monument at the threshold of such chaos, either as warning to protect knowledge before the floods or as elegy after them. Its lion shape would make symbolic sense. In many prehistoric cultures, the lion represented both strength and guardianship. The Nile itself, swollen and unpredictable, could have been viewed as a devouring beast. To carve its likeness into stone was to master it, to fix the wild into permanence. Perhaps the builders saw the deluge coming with every season of heavier rain and built their sentinel to face the rising waters, a steward of memory so that, when the rivers calmed, future generations would remember who they had been. Within the mud left after those floods, scientists have found traces of exactly such renewal. New grains of pollen appear, belonging to species that thrive in moist tropical climates. Charcoal flecks show fires set deliberately, maybe part of controlled burns to clear land. Even as the climate raged, humanity adapted. People learned to plant along the narrowing highlands, to fish in the flooded valleys, to paint survivors' stories on cave walls. Out of the chaos came resilience, the first sketches of civilization drawn against the backdrop of extinction. Perhaps the Sphinx's unblinking eyes were cut to witness that courage. Its body, weathered by storm and sun, might commemorate both loss and defiance. We endured. To turn fear into architecture is a peculiarly human act. While glaciers retreated and seas rose, someone somewhere decided that memory should take the shape of a lion watching eastward into eternity. Whether they built the Sphinx before the floods to plead with the heavens, or after, to consecrate survival, the difference matters less than the impulse itself. For in the end, the stone carries both science and faith in equal measure. The sediments confirm the violence of the younger Dryas. The myths confirm the human response to it. Together, they form a single story of catastrophe and creation, of a species learning for the first time that nature could erase it and choosing courage over despair. Somewhere under cloudbursts and lightning flashes, a handful of people shaped a colossus that would outlive their language and their world. The floods receded, the climate calmed, forests gave way to sand. And on the plateau where water once roared, the lion remained, dry now, silent, still keeping watch for storms that may one day return. The Sphinx is so immense that it's easy to forget it was once merely a ridge of limestone, part of the living plateau. To carve a 66-meter body from solid rock with tools no harder than copper seems madness. Yet across the centuries, the stone itself keeps the fingerprints of its makers. Chisels that skipped, abrasions that swirled like fingerprints, grooves where hammerstones struck again and again. Step close to the paws, and you can still trace the rhythm of their labor. the granular chatter of intention meeting geology. Experimental archaeologists have tried to replicate such work, hacking into limestone blocks using only the implements known from early dynastic Egypt. Copper chisels, dolerite pounders, sandstone rubbers mixed with desert sand as an abrasive. Hours of effort yield a few inches of depth, but done collaboratively, hundreds of hands swinging in shifts, the task becomes plausible. The plateau's stone, though hard, contains softer layers that can be coaxed apart. The quarry itself almost invites shape once labor begins. The real miracle is not technique, but endurance. Years of steady hammering in heat where air shimmers and dust coats every breath. However, the tool marks scattered across the Sphinx's body tell of more than one age of workmanship. On lower, weather-bitten layers, archaeologists find rough, wide strikes consistent with stone pounders. Primitive, almost impatient blows. Higher up, particularly on the chest and parts of the face, the marks narrow into finer grooves typical of later chiseling. Even the cut of the headdress seems to shift midway, from crude sculpting to controlled lines that could not have come from the same era. The Sphinx, in other words, was never finished once and left alone. It was revisited, retouched, perhaps even reinvented, over thousands of years. Imagine the process. The first sculptors begin by tracing a lion in the bedrock, marking out paws and haunches. They dig trenches around the figure until the outline emerges like a fossil being revealed, then carve inward, releasing a body from its own shadow. The head comes last, more difficult because of fissures in the rock and because expression demands precision. Generations later, after rains and winds have worn away details, new artisans climb the spine with their own tools. Now perhaps bronze or early copper hardened by arsenic. Recarving what is faded, reshaping the nose, cutting deeper the eyes. Each touch is an act of preservation and appropriation both. It may be that the earliest phase, the so-called core sculpture, was built by people whose aim was purely cosmic, the lion as guardian of the horizon. Millennia later, under Khafre or Thutmose, other hands arrived with new prayers and new identities. The mask changed, but the monument remained. The evidence rests in seams sealed by ancient plaster between blocks at the headdress and in repairs along the flanks that use stone quarried centuries apart. Restoration in Egypt has always been a dialogue between reverence and revision. Every ruler sought to mend what was crumbling while ensuring that the healed version bore his own signature. Modern engineers have mapped the Sphinx's weathering as though scanning the wrinkles of an ancient face. Behind each groove lies a different voice. Some surfaces shine with the polish of abrasion. Others still hold the granular roughness of raw quarry wall. The sequence unfolds like layered music, percussion from one epoch, melody from another, harmonized by time until no note can be separated cleanly from the rest. Yet knowing the mechanics does not lessen the wonder. Understanding that copper and sweat conquered limestone only expands our respect for those nameless workers who turned hand labor into theology. They had no cranes, no wheels, no steel edges, only rhythm, calculation, and the certainty that rock could become a message if struck in the right pattern. Perhaps they believed that carving itself was a sacred act. Each hit against the plateau a heartbeat offered to the God who commanded them to remember. And still one mystery refuses to settle. If successive generations repaired and recarved the Sphinx, what remained constant through all those changes? The stance never shifted. The direction of its gaze never turned. Whatever stories were layered above it, some original purpose survived, even where faces and crowns were altered. Engineers can measure angles, and masons can name tools. But motive leaves no fossils. Beneath all the stuas, practical genius runs a current of silence. We can imagine calloused palms and gleaming eyes behind clouds of dust, but we cannot hear their thoughts. They worked until stone breathed and then stepped back into anonymity, leaving only their strikes behind. When the wind sighs across the plateau today, it moves through those same tool marks, tracing with invisible fingers the labor of forgotten builders. The Sphinx remains their final exhale, a monument carved by countless hands whose names were surrendered to time, so that the stone itself could speak forever in their stead. From a distance, the Sphinx appears seamless, an unbroken image of authority rising from the desert, forever poised and complete. But up close, proportion betrays illusion. The head seems curiously small for the lion's immense shoulders, as though the sculpture had been forced to exchange one identity for another. Its skull is narrow, its face too delicate for the body's might. And between those features lies a jagged story of alteration. At some point in its long watch over the horizon, the guardian may have been recast. Once perhaps a full lion staring toward the dawn, it was reshaped into a king gazing at the sun. Erosion draws the map of this transformation. The grooves at the neck where head meets body don't follow the same pattern of decay. The weathering around the face is smoother, the outer fabric less pitted than the torso, suggesting newer workmanship carved into older stone. The headdress, carved tight around the skull, cuts into areas that might once have formed the lion's mane. Even the question of the broken nose has layers. While often blamed on cannon fire or defacement, the damage may conceal earlier resculpting that altered the angle of the profile long before any act of vandalism. The evidence, faint but persistent, points toward a lion whose face was reduced, reshaped, and humanized. Anthropometric analysis supports the suspicion. When scholars compared the Sphinx's surviving facial features with confirmed sculptures of Pharaoh Khafre, the supposed builder, they found mismatches impossible to ignore. The jawline of Khafre's statues extends broader and straighter than that of the Sphinx. The ears are set differently, the cranial ratio uneven. Even allowing for erosion, the geometry doesn't align. Some researchers noted that the Sphinx's expression, far from the poised divinity of Khafre, carries a subtler melancholy. The eyes are heavier, the lips neither smiling nor stern but distant. It is the look of something dreamed rather than decreed. If those measurements tell us that the Sphinx's face is not Khafre's, then whose is it? The simplest answer is that it belongs to nobody at all, that it was never meant as portraiture, but as symbol. The act of recutting a lion's head into a human's may have served as Egypt's earliest declaration of divine kingship. Man triumphing over beast, civilization declaring mastery over nature. To carve the intelligence of humanity onto the strength of a lion was to fuse heaven, earth, and ruler into a single visage. Yet the more poetic answer carries deeper resonance. What if, to the restorers of that later age, reshaping the Sphinx was also an act of reconciliation, a way of claiming kinship with a relic they did not create, of writing their own story upon an incomprehensible inheritance? A mask placed lovingly over the bones of a god. Imagining the process is both awful and intimate. Tools clink on the brow, dust billows as artisans measure and measure again, nervous at the enormity of what they alter. Every stroke has consequence. A slip of a chisel could destroy the profile forever. Below them, the lion's body lies patient, ancient, so large that its tail curls behind their scaffolding like a forgotten question mark. The desert sun blazes down, burning sweat into eyes, and still they work, obedient to their pharaoh. but perhaps dimly aware that they are writing over voices older than memory. When they finish, they unveil not a new creation, but a compromise. Part predator, part man, a hybrid perfected for eternity. That duality became the Sphinx's soul. Later generations would see in its human gaze wisdom and protectorship. In its leonine power, the unyielding spirit of the land. Its small head, jarringly scaled, might not be aesthetic error, but meaningful paradox. Humanity anchored within something vast. Reason clothed in instinct. The imbalance makes the Sphinx alive. Without it, the statue might read as mere imitation of nature. With it, the Sphinx embodies the strangeness of consciousness itself. Mind rising from the muscle of earth. If the lion's face was indeed replaced by a pharaoh's, we are left with a haunting thought. That Egypt's kings stood before this monument feeling the same unease we feel today. They too sensed its age, its otherness, its silence stretching back beyond their chronicles. In their reverence, they sought to fix that silence into their own image, to bridge the abyss with recognition. The recutting of the head might therefore be not arrogance, but yearning, a human attempt to comprehend a guardian older than gods. Somewhere beneath the features now eroded by time may linger the outlines of another face, eroded but not erased. The first identity of the Sphinx. It stares unseen from within the stone, watching through the borrowed mask of a ruler, as if allowing Egypt's kings to reign upon its body, while its true spirit, older and unfathomable, endures below. Beside the Sphinx, where crowds rarely linger, two ancient structures crouch, half buried in sand and shadow. Most visitors mistake them for later additions, weathered platforms, perhaps, or the remains of a shrine. But these are the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple, the great siblings carved from the same stone that freed the lion from its bedrock cradle. Their massive blocks, many weighing more than 30 tons, were not hauled from distant quarries, but lifted directly from the moat-like trench surrounding the monument. When the Sphinx was born, these temples were built in the same breath. The cut blocks set aside like puzzle pieces to raise walls as old as the guardian itself. Even after millennia of erosion, the craftsmanship challenges comprehension. The limestone blocks interlock with an accuracy rivaling any later civilization. Their seams are tight enough to resist a knife blade, each stone shaped to nestle into the subtle bulge or recess of its neighbor. The wall corners curve with mathematical precision, guiding the eye inward to chambers that once glowed with polished granite. Those inner surfaces, sheathed in red Aswan stone, mirror the deep resonances of Göbekli Tepe's pillars far to the north. Though separated by continents and time, both belong to an architectural philosophy obsessed with balance. Massive weight made graceful through alignment. Archaeologists usually describe the temples as old kingdom works contemporary with Khafra's reign. Yet the texture of their weathering tells another story. The outer blocks are so deeply pitted that the original surfaces are nearly dissolved, while the joints within remain intact, as if the facing stones endured long erosion before later builders reclaimed them. Some geologists suspect that the lower courses once stood exposed during the great rains at the end of the Ice Age. If true, then the Sphinx, its temple, and the Valley Temple form not separate dynastic projects, but parts of a single prehistoric complex. An acropolis that anchored rituals along a Nile very different from today's river. Walking through the interior of the Valley Temple feels less like exploring an Egyptian sanctuary than stepping into some primordial machine built for sound. The air carries a faint metallic hum, a resonance drawn from stone. Engineers mapping the space have discovered that the wall's arrangement amplifies low frequencies. producing tones when wind moves through the empty corridors. Experiments show that chanting or drumming inside can create standing waves, making the floor itself vibrate. If intentional, it means the temple's designers understood acoustic shaping thousands of years before modern physics could name it. Imagine ceremonies performed here, priests or healers chanting as the walls echoed back harmonics that rippled through the body, blurring the line between worship and technology. Decades of excavation have revealed only the upper portions of the temples. Beneath them lies mystery still sealed. Seismic surveys in the late 20th century sent waves through the plateau and returned signals no one expected. Beneath the southern edge of the Sphinx temple appeared dense anomalies, voids outlining a deeper foundation or possibly stairways descending to a buried level. Drill cores confirmed compact layers of fill above what could be intact chambers. Egyptian authorities, cautious of damaging national relics, halted invasive exploration. But the whispers from the instruments remain. Geometry waiting in darkness just below the threshold of our patience. If these subterranean levels exist, they would rewrite the map of Giza's origins. A temple half concealed beneath another hints at rebuilding across ages, new beliefs erected on forgotten sanctuaries. Perhaps every dynasty that touched this ground built atop the bones of the previous one, compelled by some unbroken spiritual magnetism. The plateau becomes less a city of tombs than a living palimpsest, its structures folding one atop another like sedimentary pages of faith. At dusk, the light falls low over the Sphinx, spilling into the temple courtyards and turning the limestone blocks to molten gold. The patterns of erosion catch fire for a heartbeat, then fade into violet shadow. Beneath those shadows, the sensors buried in sand hum softly, tracing impulses through stone. On their screens back at the research tents, uncertain lines blink, arcs that could be fractures, rooms, or something in between. The scientists do not speak. They simply watch the readings climb and fall, like the rhythm of a sleeping creature's breath. The Sphinx and its twin temples seem to listen as well, their ancient silence deepening as the desert night closes in. Whatever waits beneath remains unseen, diligent in secrecy, until the earth itself decides that its hidden architecture has been patient long enough. Long before the first hieroglyph carved the name of a pharaoh, the image of the lion had already prowled through the imagination of the human mind. Across Africa, in the savannas where dawn lit grass in fire-orange flame, hunters told stories of the beast who walked between worlds, whose very breath carried the color of sunrise. They revered not just its strength, but the mystery of its timing, the way lions hunt when night retreats, yet before the sun grows merciless. The animal lived, literally, in the seam of light and shadow. That poetic instinct may be the oldest seed of the Sphinx itself. Anthropologists tracing the figure of the lion across ancient art find the same symbol recurring in lands far apart. Rock faces in the Sudan carved with maned predators haloed by circles, reliefs in Mesopotamia showing lions walking beside winged suns, seals from Iran depicting leonine guardians at gateways of light. These were not mere decorations, but scripts in a universal language. To call upon the lion was to invoke balance between danger and renewal, darkness and radiance. The creature represented the heart of the horizon, where endings turned inevitably into beginnings. When the first villagers of the Nile watched the orb of the sun rise from the east, they must have seen it as both creation and threat, a god that could feed crops or burn them to ash. A protector was needed, an intermediary that could look the solar god in the eye. The earliest hymns to Ra, written millennia after the Sphinx, still remember this tension. O Lion of the Morning, guardian of the gates, open for the sun, its path of rebirth. That title feels like an echo resonating backward through time, describing a monument that had been watching long before those hymns took shape. From this perspective, the question shifts away from who carved the Sphinx to why they felt compelled to do so. Civilizations do not move thousands of tons of rock without necessity. Power alone cannot explain it. Fear and devotion together can. Perhaps the green Sahara people of 11 or 12,000 years ago, facing thunderclouds and floods that merged night and day into ceaseless twilight, sought harmony with the sky's volatility. They envisioned a lion carved from the very plateau, to face dawn as they could not, to absorb the brilliance that might otherwise blind. The idea of a guardian at the horizon was not symbolic indulgence. It was survival translated into myth. Later generations inherited and redefined that meaning. As Egyptian theology crystallized, the Sphinx became Hor-em-Akhet, Horus of the horizon, the rising sun itself. Yet under that later doctrine lingers something older and less anthropomorphic, a primordial vigilance. Standing before the Sphinx at first light, one senses it not as ruler or deity, but as sentient threshold. The moment when sunlight first grazes its massive brow seems to animate the stone, shifting it from nocturnal silhouette to living presence. Day is born through it, as if the sun depends on its permission. Every civilization born beneath a vast sky has built something to anchor its fear of immensity. Stone circles in Britain frame solstices. Ziggurats in Sumer climb toward the sun. The Sphinx, however, faces outward rather than upward, a sentinel rather than supplicant. It does not ascend to meet heaven. It waits, unflinching, for heaven to come to it. That posture transforms myth into philosophy. The builders may have believed that the horizon was a living gate, an opening through which cosmic forces passed each day. To carve a lion, there was to place a guardian at the very hinge of time, ensuring that dawn arrived in peace. If this interpretation holds, the Sphinx's silence becomes intelligible. It does not speak because speaking would disturb balance. Its power lies in stillness, in eternal vigilance that neither implores nor defies the sun. Perhaps that is why even now, after empires have risen and eroded around it, we approach with hushed awe. On some deep instinct, we still recognize the outline carved by our ancestors' fear, a creature forged to confront the brilliance we cannot face directly. When night fades and the first rays cut over the plateau, the great head glows pale gold, and the shadow of its body stretches miles toward the west, linking darkness to light. In that instant, the Sphinx fulfills the role it was born for. Guardian between night and day, tether keeping chaos at bay, bridge between the human and the divine. Whoever made it may have vanished with their rivers and storms, yet their understanding remains inscribed in posture and gaze. The lion endures, and with each sunrise, it repeats the oldest prayer of all, that light may return again, and that we may be ready to meet it. When Robert Schoch's claims burst into the public eye, Egyptology found itself painted as the enemy of discovery, a caricature of dogmatic scholars guarding dusty tomes. In reality, those dissenting voices were far from villains. They were professionals who had built their lives studying the patterns and patience of history. And to watch an outsider challenge the bedrock of their discipline was like hearing someone insist that the Nile flowed backward. Their defense of the orthodox timeline was not stubborn pride, but loyalty to evidence gathered over a century. To them, the Sphinx belonged firmly within the rhythm of the Old Kingdom, an era of organized labor, defined iconography, and the first pyramids that bent humankind's will into geometry. Mark Lenner, one of the plateau's most experienced excavators, had lived at Giza for decades. To his eye, every feature of the Sphinx's context tethered it to Khafre's time. The surrounding causeway leading from the pyramid complex flows directly to the statue's right flank, connecting it like a nervous system to the master tomb. Down to the smallest detail, the alignment of nearby boat pits, the function of adjacent workshops, it fit neatly within the 4th Dynasty landscape. You can't lift it out of its environment, Leaner liked to say, brushing fine sand from a block tagged with quarry marks identical to those inside Khafre's temples. His reasoning was simple. Civilizations leave fingerprints. The same kinds of copper chisels and dolerite pounders found at the pyramids turn up near the Sphinx. The mason's signature, smooth corners, even the workers' graffiti naming royal crews, all belong to that same age. Other Egyptologists echoed him. They pointed to inscriptions recording laborers hauling great stones under Khafre's reign, to old kingdom reliefs celebrating sun worship at the horizon where the Sphinx now gazes. A civilization meticulous in recording achievements, they argued, would hardly omit its greatest monument. If no earlier culture had left trace of comparable architecture, no tools, skeletons, settlements, then pushing the Sphinx back 7,000 years meant inventing an entire lost society, ex nihilo. As for the geological evidence, they turned it on itself. The wave-like forms on the statue's trench could, they said, be shaped by other forces. Creeping groundwater dissolving the stone in patterns indistinguishable from rainfall, or salt crystallization expanding within pores until outer layers flaked away. One Egyptian geologist likened the process to a slow explosion beneath the skin of the rock. Fault lines, too, those ancient fractures still shifting, under Nile sediments, could have sped uneven erosion. Nature wears many masks, they cautioned. Geology is poetry, if misread. For years, the dispute seesawed between camps. Field conferences felt like courtroom dramas, each expert unveiling slides, cross-examining arguments, questioning not just data, but definitions. And though the words grew heated, something noble glimmered underneath. The shared devotion to evidence, even when it disobeyed expectation. Science, after all, depends on doubt as much as discovery. Without skepticism, it calcifies. Without imagination, it drifts into folklore. The Sphinx became a mirror reflecting that tension, not scientist versus mystic, but curiosity wrestling with its own reflection. Admittedly, the dissenters had logic on their side. Archaeology thrives on continuity, on the slow layering of cultures stacking one atop another. Evidence of a prehistoric master builder had yet to surface anywhere else along the Nile. And yet, while mainstream scholars stuck to their established framework, they sometimes found the questions unsettling their certainty impossible to silence. Why was the Sphinx cut so deeply into the bedrock when later statues were built from quarried blocks? Why had no explicit inscription named Khafre its creator, only restorers centuries later? Even among skeptics, faint curiosity began to stir beneath the armor of consensus. Outside academia, the debate hardened into spectacle. Television specials touting forgotten civilizations, editorials defending the orthodoxy. To the scientists laboring through desert dawns, these sensationalized portrayals felt both exasperating and necessary. They drew attention and funding, but they reduced nuanced conversation to headlines. Many Egyptologists privately admitted a grudging respect for Shaka's persistence. It forced them to re-examine assumptions and refine their own data. In that sense, contention became collaboration in disguise. By the mid-1990s, new analyses of mineral salts and microstrata suggested a middle path, erosion indeed older than the Old Kingdom, yet possibly caused by prolonged humidity rather than primeval rainfall. It neither crowned nor condemned any theory. Like the Sphinx itself, it merely waited, ambiguous and unmoved. The episode stands today as proof of science's paradoxical grace. That truth often lives between disciplines, stitched together by disagreement. Archaeologists need geologists, and geologists need historians. Each sees half of the puzzle. Only together do they glimpse the full horizon. As the sun sets over Giza, experts and dreamers alike can be found sitting on the edge of the plateau, arguing softly into the wind, the same wind that once scoured the monument they debate. Their words vanish into the dusk, leaving the Sphinx indifferent. It listens to both camps with equal serenity, its eroded ears full of sand, its silence reminding them that every answer, when spoken too loudly, becomes another question waiting to be weathered. Learning to read stone begins with humility. To the untrained eye, rock is mute, an inert thing, heavy and stoic. But under the scientist's lens, silence gives way to speech. Every mineral grain, every fault, every pattern of erosion is a syllable in an immense language still being deciphered. The Sphinx, having endured the entire span of recorded history and much that came before, is as close to a perfect library as nature and man could create together. Its pages are limestone, its ink water and time. And if you know how to listen, those pages whisper of epochs that no human voice ever lived to describe. In laboratories far from the desert, samples from the Sphinx's enclosure lie under microscopes. Within each flake of stone gleam microscopic fossils, tiny shells of foraminifera and algae that once floated in a shallow sea more than 50 million years before the carving began. These fossils determine the stone's origin and its hardness, yet they also help trace how moisture later seeped through it. When exposed to long stretches of wet climate, the calcite crystals within the limestone change shape, growing cloudy from repeated dissolving and recrystallizing. The pattern becomes a timeline of rainfall, a natural graph etched molecule by molecule. Under polarized light, links of crystal flash like coded text, telling the geologist not only that water touched them, but how often and for how long. Spectrographic analysis adds another layer of vocabulary. By bombarding the stone's surface with tiny energy pulses and measuring the reflected wavelengths, scientists map its chemical alterations. Layers rich in sulfur oxides and nitrates reveal contact with acidic rain. Layers dominated by calcium carbonate speak of drier ages dominated by wind. Each centimeter of rock stores centuries of atmospheric memory, as if the desert itself had taken notes on passing weather. Combining thousands of readings across the Sphinx's flanks, researchers can reconstruct a rhythm of climate change reaching far deeper into prehistory than any papyrus scroll. It tells of a wetter world that gradually hardened, of storms that came in cycles long before the term civilization meant anything at all. Beyond chemical whispers lie vibrations a human ear cannot detect. Acoustic engineers have begun testing monoliths with tools more suited to concert halls than dig sites. By striking the stone lightly and recording how it resonates, they can gauge density and hidden fractures. When this was done at Giza, parts of the Sphinx responded with tones lower than human hearing, while others rang clear and bell-like through the sand. Differences in resonance reveal sections repaired or recarved, each alteration a small pause in the stone's continuous monologue. To walk around the monument as sensors echo their pulses is to hear a deep hum rising from beneath the desert, as though the entire plateau were murmuring in its sleep. Data from these various methods, microscopic, spectrographic, acoustic, form more than dry graphs. They map emotion into stone. Weathering rates become time signatures, vibrations become voices, Mineral concentrations become inflection and dialect. The Sphinx is not only ancient art. It is climate record, geological ledger, and acoustic chamber combined. Its story expands far beyond Egypt. The grooves carved by rain share their shape with similar scars on cliffs in Sudan, Syria, and the edges of the Red Sea, confirming that the same long monsoon once beat upon all of North Africa. Nature, indifferent to borders, wrote one paragraph across an entire continent. Standing before the monument, aware of these layers of language, one begins to feel small, not in the presence of mystery, but in the presence of information. Each pink streak of iron oxide, each ripple of softened stone, is a note inscribed in Earth's vast autobiography. The people who hewed the lion from the plateau translated belief into sculpture. Millennia later, scientists translate geology into memory. Strange how both pursuits mirror each other. Ancient masons and modern researchers, each trying to coax meaning from stone, each believing the answers lie just beneath the surface. When night falls on Giza, the rock cools and contracts, groaning faintly. Sensors pick up those whispers too, breaths made by temperature itself. The lion seems alive, turning in sleep, speaking in the slow language of elements. To know that its skin holds traces of forgotten storms and vanished atmospheres is to realize that the Sphinx, far from being silent, has been telling its story since the moment the first chisel struck. We are only just learning to translate it, one crystal at a time, one frequency at a time, reading the oldest poem on Earth letter by glittering letter. For as long as it has watched the horizon, the Sphinx has known the patience of burial. Sand is both enemy and ally, a hunter that consumes and a blanket that preserves. Over centuries, dunes have flowed across the Giza plateau like waves made of time, rising until they drown even stone, then retreating just enough for another generation to believe itself discoverer. In that rhythm of concealment and revelation, the history of the Sphinx is written half in memory, half in forgetting. The earliest record of unearthing comes from a prince who dreamed. Around 1400 BCE, young Thutmose, not yet the ruler he would become, sought shade near the sculpture, then little more than a head protruding from the desert. The story preserved on a red granite stele between its paws tells how, while he slept, the Great Sphinx spoke. It promised him the throne if he would clear the sand choking its body. Thutmose awoke determined, summoned workers, and cut away the dunes until the lion once again stood exposed to daylight. Out of gratitude, the new pharaoh restored part of its surface and erected the dream stele to honor the voice that had chosen him. In his account, we hear both mystical awe and practical fatigue, the labor of hundreds of men hauling away the endless, returning sea of sand. But the desert forgets favors quickly. Within a handful of centuries, the dunes rolled back. Greek travelers during the classical period wrote of a colossal head emerging from hills of golden dust, as if nature herself sculpted half a statue for effect. The rest of the body lay buried deeper than they believed any monument could reach. Pilgrims left offerings at what they thought a mountain shaped like a face of a god. To them, the Sphinx belonged less to human artisanship than to divine geology. The idea never fully faded. By late antiquity, drifting sand had erased nearly all of it once more. When Napoleon's forces arrived in 1798, sketching the wonders of Egypt in their massive description de l'Egypte, they too found only a head, but were certain it concealed enormity. Soldiers posed for engravings beside its immense chin, firing muskets whose smoke rose like offerings. They named it Le Monstre, the monster of Giza, and tried to measure what they could not see. The buried body became a symbol of the unknown past itself, sleeping under desert silence. Throughout the 19th century, explorers returned with spades and ambition. Some excavated only to have the wind undo their efforts within a few seasons. Others sought hidden doorways that never appeared. The desert seemed protective, as if determined to ration revelation on its own timetable. Yet, paradoxically, this same covering preserved the monument when exposure might have destroyed it. The parts encased in sand remain far better kept than those shoulders and haunches left to blister. The Sphinx survives precisely because it has been smothered again and again. Every cycle of submergence rewrites human history. Each rediscovery births a new narrative. Thutmose saw a god, the Greeks a mystery, Napoleon a trophy of empire, modern archaeologists an equation of rain and time. None of them met quite the same being. Each knew a different Sphinx, according to how much of her the desert agreed to reveal. Perhaps that is her secret, to remain plural, multiplied through sediment and imagination alike. Today the statue stands largely free, its lower layers braced by modern retaining walls. Yet the plateau still breathes. Each storm brings back a hint of the ancient ritual, the fine hiss of sand skating against limestone. The first thin drifts accumulating at the paws like returning memories. Geologists warn that within decades of neglect, dunes would again roll over the enclosure and erase modern footprints as ruthlessly as they erased hieroglyphs. The desert always wins, given time. Sometimes, when night winds rise and grains twist in small, rippling eddies across the floor of the pit, it seems the Sphinx is inhaling. The air cools, and the sound deepens into a whisper that might be the voice Thutmose claimed to hear millennia. Agro, a reminder that revelation is fleeting. We uncover and we forget. Knowledge, like sand, slips endlessly through our fingers. And somewhere a few meters deeper, beneath the debris settled since our last excavation, other details still lie waiting. Fragments of stone, inscriptions, perhaps another stele. The dunes protect them until we are ready, or until curiosity tires again. And the desert, with infinite calm, resumes its work of erasing the world in order to keep it. In the temples and tombs of Egypt, the walls speak in riddles as old as the language itself. Paintings shimmer with gods that live and die each day, sailing through the sky on boats of fire. Central to this endless drama is Ra, the sun, whose daily voyage from dawn to dusk is more than a simple celestial routine. It is the rhythm of existence. Each sunrise marks his rebirth. Each sunset his descent into the underworld, where serpents of chaos wait to devour his light before it can return. And poised on the eastern edge of that eternal pilgrimage stands Hor-em-Akhet, Horus of the horizon, the Sphinx. She is no longer merely stone. She is the living emblem of that sacred transition, the guardian between night and day, life and death, despair and renewal. If the old kingdom priests inherited this story from an age already ancient, then its power lies not just in theology, but in memory. Many cultures built myths around the rising and setting of the sun. Yet the Egyptians rendered the cycle physical, a geography of spirit carved into the landscape itself. The horizon was a tangible place, a door needing protection, and Hor-em-Akhet was its keeper. Behind such vivid symbolism, however, might lurk a collective recollection of something real, something Earth once endured that made the idea of death and rebirth more than metaphor. When scholars mapped the most ancient Egyptian hymns, small anomalies appeared. Certain references to the great drowning of the world, or the day the light faltered, echo across texts separated by centuries. They describe not moral sin or divine punishment, but environmental convulsion, Storms that erase fields, the sky darkened with dust, rivers rising beyond measure. These passages once puzzled translators. Now, seen alongside geological evidence of the Younger Dryas floods, they sound eerily familiar. Perhaps the priests of Ra were not merely dramatizing the sun's setting, but remembering a prehistoric catastrophe. A deluge, or cosmic shock so absolute, it redefined cosmic order for generations. The sun's death each night may have recalled the time when the heavens truly did go black. If the Sphinx arose in the wake of such trauma, then its mythology is both prayer and archive. To carve Hor-em-Akhet into the plateau was to promise the cosmos that balance could return. Every dawn that gilded the statue confirmed that the world still turned correctly. The rituals surrounding it, the chants, the offerings poured into the sand, were less about appeasing gods and more about rehearsing resilience. In the human psychology of survival, retelling is remembrance. Myth, then, becomes a code in which events are transformed into narrative symbols to remain understandable even after their factual origins have dissolved. Consider how the Sphinx's leonine body and human face fit within this spiritual lexicon. Lions in Egyptian art were embodiments of solar force, while human features symbolized reasoning soul. United, they made a creature capable of confronting both chaos below and order above. Each morning, when the sun emerged from the eastern horizon, priests hailed it as Horus the Child rising from the primeval waters, an image that might have once described the re-emergence of land after inundation. The Sphinx incarnates that dual memory. Catastrophe survived. The promise of renewal sculpted permanent, so the next generation would not forget the rhythm of destruction and resurrection that defines existence itself. To modern eyes, these myths may feel distant, but through their poetry, we can sense our ancestors' trembling awe. They watched not only the beauty of dawn, but the anxiety behind it. Knowledge that daylight is always earned anew. Perhaps that is why the Sphinx's gaze remains forward, never over its shoulder. It looks eternally to the horizon, as if ensuring the story's cycle continues, that Ra's ship indeed returns, that the flood waters of chaos stay sealed beneath. In this way, the myths surrounding the Sphinx function like time capsules. Even as erosion consumes inscriptions and storms reshape the plateau, legends carry details the stone will eventually lose. They record through metaphor what cannot be preserved through matter. The feeling of survival, the gratitude of a world that has seen its own nearly final night. Mythology becomes both memory and monument, and in ancient Egypt, those two were indistinguishable. Whether the tales sprang from imagination or the trauma of real cataclysm, they left behind a message the desert still repeats every morning when the sun strikes the Sphinx's face. Light returns, darkness passes, and on the brink of dawn, a silent guardian renews the vow first made by a forgotten civilization. To watch, to remember, and to stand as the horizon's keeper until memory and sunlight are one and the same. In the modern age, we have learned to see the invisible. From hundreds of miles above, satellites scan the skin of the Earth in spectra beyond human sight, peeling away layers of illusion grain by grain. When these instruments aimed their gaze at the western desert of Egypt, they revealed something astonishing. Beneath the dunes west of Giza lie the faint traces of sinuous lines, buried like veins beneath old skin. They are not roads or fault fractures, but the remnants of ancient waterways, ghost rivers etched in sand. Their curves match the logic of flowing water, meandering toward the lowlands and vanishing under deposits of wind-blown dust. To scientists studying the Sphinx and its mysterious erosion, the discovery felt like hearing the echo of a forgotten climate. These channels, some more than a kilometer wide, show up vividly in radar images taken by orbital sensors capable of penetrating dry sand. When first analyzed, the patterns startled geologists. They mirrored modern river systems in size and behavior, yet none corresponded to any existing river today. It was as though the Nile, tireless storyteller of Egypt's fate, once told a different tale entirely. Its voice split into tributaries flowing across regions now parched for thousands of years. Computer models reconstructed how rainfall from shifting monsoons might once have fed these channels 12,000 years ago, cascading down from highlands toward a greener Giza. The plateau on which the Sphinx rests would not have been a barren shelf, but a bluff overlooking a mosaic of wetlands and shallow lakes. The perfect setting for communities who understood both water and stone. Following the digital maps, archaeologists traced subtle changes in soil moisture along those invisible riverbeds. Even today, certain stretches nurture faint lines of acacia growth or oddly fertile ground. Beneath the surface, satellite-guided coring teams struck sediments rich with rounded pebbles and freshwater shells. Proof that the rivers were real and once powerful. What they reveal aligns eerily with the water erosion scars on the Sphinx and its enclosure. The monument's flanks, rounded and furrowed, could well have been shaped by rainstorms fed through this vanished river network, its fluvial breath soaking the plateau. The implications ripple far beyond the Sphinx. If these rivers existed when the monument was young, then the entire picture of ancient Egypt's origin must expand westward into what we call desert. Quarry sites, once thought improbably distant from building projects, suddenly make sense when overlaid upon these old watercourses. Massive stones could have been moved by river barges along channels that later dried, their routes forgotten as the world hardened into sand. To the builders, movement and construction would have been easier. The plateau accessible by water rather than endless trudging. Remote sensing has also identified intriguing rectilinear depressions, potential harbor basins, along the course of these extinct channels. One, lying a few kilometers south of the pyramids, aligns precisely with the elevation of the ancient Nile's floodplain around 10,000 BCE. It suggests that Giza's monuments once stood at the edge of a lush corridor, their reflection shimmering in distant lagoons, the Sphinx facing dawn over an inland delta instead of open desert. Humanity's oldest geographical memory may stem from that scene, a landscape that nourished the birth of architecture later remembered as myth. But as we look from orbit, tracing ghost rivers glowing faintly against nightside sand, another realization takes hold, sobering and magnificent in equal measure. The Egypt we know may be only the visible tip of a civilization whose greater part sleeps under the dunes. Just as the Sphinx herself has spent much of history entombed in sand, so might towns, temples, and fields from that wetter epoch lie preserved, entombed beneath layers of shifting sediment. Radar hints at grid-like shadows in certain areas, unnatural rectilinear shapes that might mark foundations long since swallowed. Every storm buries them deeper, and every new scan seems to uncover more. The desert keeps its own archives. It silences what it destroys, yet it also guards. Those dry river arteries remind us that time can invert geography. What was once fertile becomes sterile. What was drowned becomes saved. Perhaps one day excavations guided by satellites will unearth docks where barges once moored or steps descending from the plateau to a vanished quay. A direct link between mankind's first engineers and the beast god that still watches their horizon. Until then, we are left with haunting imagery. rivers that no longer flow, shining faintly in ghostly blues under the scrutiny of orbit, sketching a map of a forgotten Egypt, an entire chapter of civilization still asleep beneath the patient, shifting sea of sand. The longer one studies the Sphinx, the less it feels like a statue, and the more it resembles an act of communication, an immense sentence written in a medium meant to defeat time itself. Human beings have always built larger than they need to. Long before the industrial age offered skyscrapers and rockets, we raised stone to speak for us when our voices failed. The instinct seems almost biological. Fear of forgetting translated into architecture. When language is fragile and memory mortal, stone becomes the only vocabulary sturdy enough to hope against oblivion. Psychologists call this transgenerational preservation, a drive as old as consciousness itself. Every culture has enacted it differently. Stone circles for hunters, cathedrals for theologians, satellites now drifting through space. But all share one motive: to declare we were here. In this light, the Sphinx may be more than religious devotion or royal propaganda. It is a carefully engineered memory, a message from people who anticipated their own disappearance and decided to entrust their story to geology. They chose permanence over participation, surrendering their small lives to build something that would outlive all names. The monument's scale alone suggests audience beyond the contemporary. No one standing beneath its chest could ever see it whole. The Sphinx was meant to be viewed from afar, even from future centuries. Its gaze toward the rising sun feels like punctuation at the beginning of a message still unfolding. Was it the call of astronomers marking a new celestial order, age of Leo inscribed upon the land, or the farewell letter of survivors watching, their worlds sink beneath flood and drought? Both interpretations fit the human psyche. We create to understand and to grieve. Archaeology, stripped of sentiment, still testifies to emotional engineering. Each quarry cut, each angle of orientation, demonstrates intentional durability. The builders exploited the plateau's hardest limestone for the core, softer layers only for contours that could later be recarved. Drainage channels cut along its flanks carried away rain for centuries. The Sphinx was not built to last decades of glory, but countless generations of erosion. Its makers understood where. They planned for weathering as if anticipating our curiosity millennia later. Even decay was part of the design. Some scholars see in it a cosmic clock, an attempt to synchronize human ritual with celestial recurrence, so that, when the heavens repeated their pattern, its originators might somehow be remembered. To carve the horizon's guardian at sunrise was to bind time itself, to tell future societies. This is when the sky repeated. This is when the world changed. Do not forget what we learned. If that is true, the Sphinx is both monument and message capsule, encoding astronomical coordinates and emotional truth in a single, unbreakable structure. Yet not all messages are warnings. Maybe the builders were not prophets of doom, but witnesses of continuity. Farmers and priests who saw, despite their hardships, that the sun still rose each morning. Perhaps carving a lion that faced it eternally was an act of affirmation, a visual oath to eternity rather than survival. It declared hope, that life goes on, that cycles of light always return. In this reading, the Sphinx is not a tomb for despair, but a cathedral of endurance, the human answer to the inevitability of loss. Building it made meaning itself a physical object. Modern humans still echo the impulse, only our media have changed. We send time capsules into orbit, carve data into quartz, record our existence on silicon chips that will outlast our lives, but perhaps not our civilizations. We are continuing the same ancient ritual in a language of circuits, instead of chisels. When we look at the Sphinx, we are staring at an early prototype of this endeavor, proof that the desire to be understood by descendants, or even by distant strangers, runs deeper than history. Under the Giza sun, the statue's stillness feels unnervingly alive. Wind skates across its surface, carving and erasing phrases of its story. To run a hand over those scars is to realize that the builders were right. Erosion is time's handwriting. The Sphinx's surface is the slow translation of its message, each century adding a nuance for new listeners. It tells us that all voices fade, yet meaning can endure if spoken clearly enough in matter. In the end, the great lion facing dawn is not trying to guard a kingdom or a god. It is doing what every human soul has ever done when confronted by eternity. It is making sure it will be remembered. The great transformation of Egypt began not through conquest or invention, but through the slow retreat of rain. For thousands of years after the Sphinx was carved, the Sahara pulsed with life. Monsoons from the south swept across savannas where gazelle herds thundered and lakes shimmered blue under clouds. But climate is patient, and patience changes everything. Gradually the storms withdrew, shortening their season, then vanishing altogether. The rivers that once braided through green valleys cracked into silence. What had been grassland turned brittle and pale, and the wind began its long work of sculpting dunes. Green gave way to gold. Core samples drilled into ancient lake beds across North Africa record this metamorphosis like pages of a slow diary. Layers thick with aquatic pollen give way to dust, showing year by year the shrinking of fertile oases. Radiocarbon dating marks the fall of those giant lakes between 9,000 and 6,000 years ago, the same window when humanity clustered along the dependable current of the Nile. There, water still promised continuity even as the world around it failed. The river became a ribbon of salvation in a widening desert, and on its banks the foundations of organized society quietly formed. Archaeologists can trace the migration almost like a heartbeat moving downstream. Tools identical to those once found in the ancient northern plateaus appear later near Luxor and Aswan. Pottery styles, once simple and functional, begin to show intricate paintwork, a sign of stability and surplus. Farming replaced wandering. Fishing settlements evolved into villages with planned layouts. Humanity had begun to root itself, building permanence out of necessity. Some scholars now believe that this very pressure, the need to irrigate, to record floods, to manage grain, ignited civilization. Scarcity, more than abundance, was the mother of invention. And somewhere in that transformation, the memory of the Sphinx traveled with them. Perhaps stories of a stone lion facing the sunrise were retold by the descendants of its builders around evening fires along the river. Over generations, the guardian of a vanished green world became the divine ancestor, the solar herald. The same symbolism that once belonged to storms and fertility shifted toward endurance and drought. The lion changed meaning, but not relevance. From creature of rain to creature of light. With each sunrise, farmers watched the shimmering line of the horizon and imagined Horus rising, just as the Sphinx still lifted its face to the dawn. Thus, a prehistoric monument of water became the spiritual emblem of a sun civilization. Sediment does not lie about this transition. Isotopic fingerprints in Nile mud show an increasing dominance of desert dust, the signature of a drying continent. By around 4000 BCE, rainfall had retreated so completely that the Sahara had become the sea of sand we know today. Yet out of this hardship emerged the first dynasties of Egypt, whose god-kings wore crowns in the shape of the floodplain's twin lands. What had been environmental collapse turned paradoxically into cultural genesis. The desert forced consolidation, bureaucracy, and ritual. When survival depends on predictability, science and religion intertwine. Standing at Giza now, it is hard to imagine the emerald landscape that birthed both the monument and the people who would later deify it. But traces remain. Under certain sunsets, dust carrying ancient mineral salts glows briefly green before fading to gold, as if the desert still remembers its younger skin. The Sphinx, stained by millennia of sun, embodies that transformation. Its color changed from the cool gray of wet limestone to the warm hue of its surroundings. Even its mythology adapted, claiming the sun itself as patron when the rain no longer came. The story of the Sphinx is, in essence, the story of human adaptation to a restless planet. Climate sculpted both stone and civilization, turning sanctuary into desert and wanderers into architects. As the wind hardened the plains of the Sahara, it also hardened human resolve. Out of dying lakes rose irrigation systems. Out of lost pastures emerged mathematics to measure the Nile. And out of the silence where rain once fell, a voice of stone endured. The lion guardian who had watched the turning from green to gold, and whose gaze still promises, as every dawn returns, that change need not mean extinction. It can, like the river itself, be rebirth. When wind coils through the Sphinx enclosure, it does not behave like wind on open ground. The walls that drop away around the monument form a natural amphitheater, amplifying certain tones and muting others until the air begins to tremble with a pulse you can feel through your skull. Even before science noticed it, pilgrims and priests must have sensed this strange vibration. The way a voice raised between those walls grows larger than itself. The Sphinx was already vast. Now its quiet became alive with echo, a resonance that seemed to belong to the earth rather than to any human throat. In recent decades, acousticians have turned those ancient intuitions into measurable data. Using sensitive microphones and dampers, they recorded how long sound lingers inside the hollow of the Sphinx pit. At particular frequencies, between 90 and 120 hertz, the air does not simply carry sound, but holds it, creating standing waves that reverberate up the walls and bounce back on themselves until the entire enclosure hums like a struck bell. Low drums or chants in that range magnify exponentially, blending until direction disappears. Researchers standing near the statue's paws reported feeling the vibration through their bones rather than hearing it with their ears. It is less sound than presence, as though the monument itself were speaking in frequencies too deep for language. Such discoveries have led to daring hypotheses. Was the Sphinx designed, or at least refined, to harness sound deliberately? Its builders may not have spoken of resonance, yet they knew how Egypt's desert architecture could sing. Across the Nile, temples at Dendera and Abydos have chambers whose curved ceilings focus voice into thunder. At Luxor, late afternoon light heating the stone causes audible clicks that ancient records describe as the whispering of gods. A civilization that measured stars, aligned pyramids to solstices, and shaped 10-ton blocks to hair-thin tolerances could certainly have recognized which sounds pleased the ground and which did not. If we imagine ceremony unfolding in that space, the physics begins to dissolve into wonder. Picture processions entering the enclosure before dawn, where the cool air sharpened every echo. Priests beat drums carved from hollow trunks or poured chants into conch-shaped horns, their rhythms timed to the heartbeat of the earth. Each note rolled around the pit until the Sphinx seemed to inhale it, amplifying until all distinction between performers and monument vanished. The congregation standing at the rim above might have felt the vibration rise through their feet, like the planet's own exhalation, a primal confirmation that sky, stone, and flesh were parts of one cathedral. This meeting of science and mythology does not belittle ancient faith. It deepens it. Resonance affects the body in ways older than culture. Thunder, ocean surf, even the purr of lions engage frequencies that synchronize human brainwaves into calm or awe. Modern researchers use similar vibrations in therapy to slow pulse and reduce fear. The builders of the Sphinx may have stumbled on that secret intuitively, using sound to induce trance and connection long before medicine could explain why it worked. Their rituals, half music and half geology, would have bound community to landscape, intent to phenomenon. The correlation between tone and emotion survives, even stripped of religion. When we enter the enclosure today, the silence feels thicker than ordinary quiet, as if waiting to be filled. A single cough or footstep ricochets upward and twines around the stone until one forgets its origin. Some visitors have called it unsettling. Others describe an inexplicable serenity spreading through the chest. The stone amplifies more than echoes. It amplifies attention itself. Perhaps that was always the point. The Sphinx does not merely look outward at the sun, but listens inward to the planet. It embodies equilibrium between the visual and the audible, between seeing divinity and sensing it. The same physics that sculpts its eroded curves lets it transform air into intention. In those invisible waves, we hear the oldest song. Humans conversing with the world in the only universal language. The vibration shared by heartbeat and drum, by tectonic shift and whispered prayer. At night, when warm sand cools and contracts, faint clicks flicker across the stones, like distant notes from a buried choir. Instruments record them as simple temperature responses. Imagination hears them as conversation. Either could be true. In this continuous murmuring of matter, the Sphinx remains more than sculpture. It is an instrument tuned by millennia, resonating with the breath of wind and the tremor of passing footsteps. A guardian not just of horizons, but of harmony itself, still echoing the pulse of the earth it was carved from, still holding a note that began in prehistory and has never completely faded. In recent years, technology has begun to do what centuries of argument could not: peel away the impatience of assumption. The plateau of Giza, so long studied through tape measures and photographs, has become a digital landscape where every stone can be weighed and compared without ever leaving the laboratory. LiDAR scans, pulsing laser light across the dunes, map surfaces with millimeter accuracy, stripping away shadows and vegetation to expose even the faintest contour of erosion. When these maps are layered atop an older surveys, they reveal how the Sphinx's flanks have been sculpted not only by wind and water, but by restoration itself. Traces of ancient chisels alongside those of modern conservationists. Each layer becomes a new sentence in a geological dialogue once thought closed. Artificial intelligence joined the conversation not as an oracle, but as an attentive student. Pattern recognition algorithms trained on global erosion data have begun to categorize the Sphinx's surface markings according to their probable causes. To the surprise of many, the software often classifies the deep vertical channels along the enclosure walls as water-derived rather than abrasion-derived. The conclusion is far from proof. No algorithm understands history's nuance. Yet its impartiality provides the very quality human debate lacked, a perspective immune to pride. Machines have no stakes in dynasties or reputations, and sometimes that mechanical indifference is exactly what truth requires. Three-dimensional modeling allows younger researchers to reconstruct the Sphinx under hypothetical past climates, flooding virtual rain across its carved shoulders, blasting it with simulated wind, letting decades pass in accelerated time until predictive erosion emerges. The results are subtle but revealing. The patterns closest to the monument's base correspond more closely to precipitation than to sandstorm weathering. Even skeptics admit that, in the modeled past, a wetter age leaves marks astonishingly similar to those now seen in the rock. It does not verify legend, but it complicates dismissal. Meanwhile, chemists sampling microcrusts formulating the outer surface of the limestone have detected minerals associated with ancient standing water, possibly from puddling or repeated wetting long before dynastic quarrying. Again, the evidence whispers rather than shouts, a chorus of maybes steadily eroding the old absolutism. The once iron boundary between geological and archaeological interpretation softens into dialogue. Conferences that used to echo with outrage now hum with cautious curiosity. The miracle isn't that anyone has proven the Sphinx 12,000 years old. It is that scholars again allow themselves to wonder. The change reflects a generational shift as much as a technological one. Younger archaeologists, raised in an era of open data and collaborative networks, carry fewer academic hierarchies. To them, revising a theory is not betrayal, but routine maintenance. They talk of radiogenic isotopes and drone photogrammetry the way their predecessors spoke of papyri. Collective discovery, not ownership, defines their approach. In this atmosphere, even partial agreement feels like fresh weather after long drought. One researcher recently summarized the field's attitude with humility. We may have mapped one truth too early. The plateau still has layers that have nothing to do with sand. Science, like the Nile, moves by erosion, uncertain, constant, shaping its course through persistence rather than force. Paradigms don't collapse overnight. They settle, carried grain by grain toward new deltas of understanding. The story of the Sphinx now follows that same current. Each new scan, each hesitant reanalysis, is another rivulet cutting into the bedrock of certainty, reminding us that knowledge is temporary, but inquiry eternal. To witness this unfolding reconsideration is to see the scientific method at its most human. Faith in evidence coexists with awe at mystery. Skepticism turns collegial rather than defensive. When teams set up their instruments at sunrise, the old monument looks down on them with what feels like approval. The next generation kneeling not in worship, but in patient curiosity. The Sphinx, whose body carries both rain's signature and the marks of restoration, must recognize the gesture. As daylight burns across the plateau, drones lift into the air like silver insects, tracing grids over the colossal guardian. Their hum joins the wind's whisper, data streams ascending toward satellites and distant computers that will translate geometry into insight. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the picture changes. No thunderclap of revelation, just quiet confirmation that discovery, like erosion, is cumulative. And so the scientists keep recording, adjusting, questioning, their discipline flowing forward with the same perseverance that once carved a lion from stone. Each new grain of understanding loosens the next, and the river of knowledge deepens, finding its renewed course around an ancient, watching face. In the last light of day, the Sphinx looks almost weightless, as if its 1,600 tons of stone were composed instead of memory. That illusion, sand eroding the base, distance softening its edges, makes it seem younger, fragile enough to vanish in a single dust storm. Yet the monument has already endured a climate swing so violent that continents changed color. Its survival stands at once as marvel and warning. The builders may have watched rain retreat just as we watch ice collapse into the sea. sensing the world they knew tilting toward crisis. For them, adaptation meant sculpting permanence from uncertainty. For us, it might mean rediscovering how to carve wisdom out of fear. Sediment cores and fossils tell the story in neutral tones. Around 12,000 years ago, planetary temperature climbed by several degrees within a few centuries. Grasslands withdrew, coastlines leapt inland, and wildlife disappeared. Humans responded not with resignation, but with invention. Irrigation, calendar keeping, the domestication of grain. Catastrophe pushed ingenuity. Instability became opportunity. In Egypt, that acceleration produced not only the Sphinx, but the cultural metabolism we now call civilization, the ability to translate survival into system. History's message is not that climate spares the clever, but that those who observe and adapt can turn upheaval into foundation. Familiar patterns echo today. Glaciers shrink, droughts intensify, fertile zones shift. Once again, rivers are both threatening and threatened. When scientists model the next century's rainfall, parts of the Nile Valley appear poised between inundation and desiccation, precisely the duality that sculpted Egypt's genesis. The similarities unsettle. We are not standing at the end of an age so much as at its recurrence, only this time with 7 billion hearts at stake instead of a few scattered tribes. To study the Sphinx closely is to confront this continuity. Its rain-carved body records the consequences of long weather and short attention. Its restoration scars track every human attempt to fix damage without addressing cause. A parable written in limestone. Sand blasts away painted surfaces, just as politics erases environmental foresight. Yet both processes are reversible when met with care rather than denial. The difference between ruin and resilience lies in response time. The Sphinx's ancient builders acted while the sky still darkened. Art, strangely, may again be our keenest survival tool. Those prehistoric masons transformed ecological trauma into symbol. They turned fear of the horizon into reverence for it, encoding in a single east-facing gaze the knowledge that the sun, and perhaps prosperity, always return. Their creativity bridged disaster and dawn. If modern society could channel such synthesis, using technology to design not monuments for gods, but infrastructures that honor Earth, we might prove heirs worthy of their foresight. Scientists describing modern warming often lapse into geological metaphor. They speak of feedback loops, thresholds, tipping points. Phrases that mirror the erosion cycles of the Sphinx itself. The monument's surface still changes with each season, grain by grain, teaching by demonstration that small, constant forces yield far greater transformation than any single storm. The same truth applies socially. Incremental neglect will achieve what cataclysm cannot. But so will incremental repair. If one chiselful of limestone could participate in building an immortal guardian, then one consistent gesture, planting, conserving, listening, can contribute to a restored planet. At Giza, the air cools quickly after sunset. Tourists drift away, leaving silence broken only by the hiss of sand against stone. In that quiet, the monument seems almost contemporary. A face worn by weather, yet still leaning steadfastly toward the east. Its endurance is aspirational. Perhaps the builders never intended to boast of power. Perhaps they meant to show later generations that permanence is possible only through harmony. Facing the sky, they transformed grief into geometry. Facing our own storms, we might transform anxiety into stewardship. Modern satellites orbiting above the same desert now record melting poles and vanished lakes. Their data, like the Sphinx's scars, testify that climate's script is always rewritten but seldom erased. What we choose to inscribe next, whether adaptation or arrogance, will determine the age that follows ours. The ancient artisans left their message in stone because they understood that memory is the first tool of survival. We, with our brief technologies and fragile abundance, must learn again to remember in the face of urgency. The Lion of Giza does not speak, yet its silence translates clearly enough. Change will come, but so can meaning, if we respond to the world as its caretakers rather than its passengers. Under the glare of modern instruments, the Sphinx has become a meeting ground of ideas. Geologists still examine its flanks for patterns of erosion. Astronomers trace the slow sweep of stars across its gaze, and geneticists compare the timelines of migrating peoples who may have carried its myths downstream. None of these inquiries alone can claim the whole story. Yet when their findings are viewed together, like rays of light merging through a prism, a fuller spectrum of meaning appears. An understanding of how both nature and imagination carved this monument. In quiet university laboratories, rock samples whisper their geologic testimony. Their isotopic ratios confirm long ages of exposure to both rainfall and desert wind, bridging the gap between opposing theories. Meanwhile, climate models built from satellite data reconstruct an Africa whose pulse once beat wetter and cooler, exactly when oral traditions across the continent describe a garden age of abundant rivers. At other desks, linguists trace recurring words for guardian and lion across ancient tongues, from the Nilotic dialects to Proto-Semitic roots, mapping invisible migrations of story that follow the same trails water once did. Myth, it seems, is the human translation of what geology records in stone. Astronomy provides its own chorus. Programs that rewind the sky's positions across millennia show the sun rising through Leo when the plateau was still moist. It corroborates at a cosmic level the same timing read in stratigraphy, a celestial nod to the earthbound evidence. The builders, whether conscious of precession or not, captured a moment in the relationship between heaven and horizon. Modern astrophysicists, accustomed to speaking of galaxies and light years, now find themselves aligning with ancient priests who once lifted offerings to the east. Both are observers of pattern, simply differing in accent. Genetic research adds another verse. DNA taken from early graves along the Nile shows that populations living thousands of years before the pharaohs arrived in waves from the west and the south, mirroring the retreat of green belts as the Sahara dried. Their descendants merged into river communities that would become dynastic Egypt. Within their gene sequences remain hints of adaptation to changing rainfall, skin chemistry tuned to new levels of solar exposure. The same environmental transformation the Sphinx records in weathered limestone. Evolution and erosion tell a parallel story of resilience shaped by climate's shifting will. Mythology, once dismissed as superstition, now reads like early field notes. Flood legends, solar hymns, and the recurring archetype of a lion-headed guardian may preserve cultural memories of that world remade by water. Even in distant lands, the patterns echo. In Mesopotamia's Lamassu statues, in India's Narasimha, the lion avatar guarding the threshold between mortal and divine. These are not coincidences, but correspondences. Humanity's attempt to reason with elemental power long before spectrographs or satellites existed. When all of these disciplines converse, contradictions dissolve into chorus. Science lends precision to wonder, myth gives emotion to data. The Sphinx itself proves their compatibility. A geological outcrop transformed by art, an astronomical axis cast into stone, a psychological mirror for every age that questions its meaning. It is simultaneously natural and made, empirical and poetic. Perhaps that duality explains why it endures. Each new method of analysis, laser scan, spectral reading, DNA map, only tightens the weave between fact and story, reminding us that knowledge was never intended to reside in separate rooms. In the end, the pursuit of the Sphinx's true age becomes less about the date and more about the dialogue. The monument forces disciplines to imagine together, dissolving the walls between numbers and narratives. When we place a thin slice of its rock under a microscope, crystals refract light, much like myths refract memory. Each facet truthful from its own direction. Look through all lenses at once, and the fragments cohere into a shared radiance. The Sphinx ceases to be a riddle demanding a single answer, and becomes instead an invitation. To recognize that wonder and analysis, story and science, are twin languages reading the same ancient text of planetary history. Beneath both, the Earth speaks a single sentence, one that began before us and carved in stone and starlight alike will continue long after we are gone. Sometimes, standing before the Sphinx at dawn, one has the disorienting sense that the makers have stepped away only moments ago. The wind reshuffles the sand around its paws. The horizon bleeds from violet to gold, and the desert hush feels more like a held breath than silence. In that stillness, modern cranes tower on the skyline, their long arms pivoting under the same sunlight that once lit copper chisels. The tools have changed, but the impulse remains identical. To build, to measure, to learn where Earth meets heaven. Perhaps the builders of the Sphinx never vanished at all. They have merely changed their instruments and their vocabulary. Across the world, their spirit resurfaces in concrete and steel, in the algorithms that map galaxies, in bridges that span impossible chasms. Every time a human hand sketches an arc with precision or calculates the impossible height of a tower, it repeats an echo of the same compulsion that raised the lion from limestone. The knowledge that let unknown engineers align the Sphinx with the sunrise did not die in the dunes. It diffused into the bloodstream of civilization. The mathematics of proportion, the marriage of beauty and utility, the very belief that nature's laws can be understood through patience, all trace their ancestry to minds that once shaped stone by starlight. Our telescopes, aimed outward, are their legacy turned upward. Where they sought the gods within weather and rhythm, we seek them in cosmic radiation and light years. But the motive is the same. When scientists place radio dishes across desert plains to listen for signals from the edge of the universe, they are reenacting what ancient skywatchers did on that same plateau, tilting attention to the heavens in hope of a reply. The difference between an observatory and a temple is mere perspective. Both are architectures of curiosity. The Sphinx still presides over that lineage, a silent mentor reminding us that awe and measurement are partners, not opposites. Perhaps that is what its expression has always meant to convey. The faint smile carved between eroded lips holds neither arrogance nor secrecy. It is recognition. It looks at us as one craftsman might regard another, aware that we too are engaged in translation, turning fleeting experience into form. The Sphinx endures because it recognizes the continuity of that work. The line between its creators and their descendants is unbroken, invisible, but tangible as gravity. Archaeologists and poets both listen to the same resonance beneath its stone hide. One translates it into data, the other into metaphor, but the message remains consistent. Permanence is only a collaboration between generations. The builders understood their lives were finite. They relied on us to continue reading. That, perhaps, was their truest genius. They carved not closure, but invitation. Every century that has dusted their monument with new sand also offered new interpreters of its language. By studying it, restoring it, questioning it, we fulfill our side of their bargain. The Sphinx's endurance now depends on us more literally than ever. Pollution gnaws at its features faster than ancient storms once did. Global teams wrap its body in scaffolding, inject stabilizers into its cracks, monitor its surface with laser beams. There is humility in this partnership. Our latest technology bent in service to the same structure whose builders worked without any. Through this care, we acknowledge our inheritance, keeping alive not only the monument, but the shared obsession with time that birthed it. When night descends, floodlights replace torches and satellites blink overhead, each a modern sentinel. The builders have returned in circuitry and code, in artists and engineers scattered across a planet that still wrestles with impermanence. Some design robots to restore coral reefs, others send machines to Mars. All are chiseling continuity against decay. The Sphinx, scarred yet serene, mirrors those efforts back at us. Under moonlight, its gaze looks almost approving, as if to say the work never ended, it only changed form. So the riddle persists, not as a question demanding an answer, but as dialogue renewed with each generation. The Sphinx asks only that we keep building, keep remembering, keep shaping meaning from the raw edge of chaos. Its eyes meet the sky while its body anchors the ground, fusing aspiration with stability. In that balance lies the true inheritance of its makers and ours. The faith that knowledge, art, and care can outlast fear. When dawn comes again and sunlight crawls along the ancient face, we can almost hear the stone whisper what the first chisel once promised. Continue. Each morning, before the tour buses arrive, and the noise of the city leaks back over the dunes, the desert performs the ritual it has kept for millennia. The first line of sunlight breaks the horizon, strikes the Sphinx's forehead, and runs down her features until the stone burns gold. In those few minutes, the statue appears awake, her face so alive that even the wind seems to hold its breath. Around her lies a silence older than storytelling, a pause that gathers every theory, every argument, all the centuries of speculation whispering through her shadow. To stand there is to feel the whole conversation of our species condensed into one gaze. Scholars and dreamers have quarreled for generations about her origin. Khafra's architects or forgotten builders from a greener age, lion or king, symbol or survivor. Yet the closer the studies come, the farther the truth moves away, as if the monument itself enjoys the chase. Perhaps that is her real purpose, to remind us that mystery is not failure, but fuel, that what we cannot easily know keeps us reaching. Whether carved 5,000 or 12,000 years ago, the Sphinx fulfills her timeless task, forcing us to look both outward toward the stars and inward toward the questions that make us sentient. In her calm expression lies the perfect equilibrium between certainty and wonder. The engineers who mapped her erosion, the poets who found gods in her shadow, the tourists who stare in disbelief, they all share the same inheritance. Each seeks continuity with something larger, a bridge between mortal scale and cosmic duration. The Sphinx offers both. She is data and dream, fossil and fable, her silence containing enough space for every interpretation to coexist. The scarred surface does not diminish meaning, it collects it, the way sunrise collects color across her face. As the world beyond the plateau rushes faster toward noise and light, the Sphinx's patience becomes radical. She watches empires fade, religions rewrite themselves, satellites blink overhead, and still she waits, unhurried. To her, centuries are weather. Our brilliance and our confusion pass across her eyes like brief clouds. She has no need to answer our questions, because the asking itself is what keeps us human. Her riddle was never, "Who built me?" but, "Will you keep wondering?" Looking into that face, one realizes how seamlessly knowledge and reverence can coexist. Science extracts the measurable from her stone. Myth supplies the meaning we crave. Together, they complete the picture. The Sphinx does not require belief, only attention, an awareness that awe can stand beside understanding without either losing its dignity. For every chiseled line that yields to geological explanation, another curve stirs metaphor. She is equally at home in the microscope and the poem. Around her, the desert reclaims and releases the land in its slow rhythm. The same sand that once buried her to the neck now drifts harmlessly around scaffolding and tourists' feet, proof that time's appetite never quite defeats persistence. Within the cracks and crevices, swallows build their nests, tiny architects continuing the legacy of making meaning from dust. Each flutter of wings, each grain of sediment carried by wind, keeps the monument alive. The Sphinx endures not because she resists change, but because she absorbs it. She has learned the oldest principle of survival. To remain, one must adapt without losing form. When the sun finally clears the horizon, the full landscape emerges, the pyramids gleaming to the west, Cairo's haze glowing faintly in the east. The Sphinx anchors the divide, past and future, silence and noise, dream and proof. In her gaze, time folds until yesterday, and tomorrow sits side by side beneath the same awakening sky. She asks for nothing and promises nothing, but somehow that restraint is comfort. So the lion still watches, through storms of sand and storms of thought, through the rise of gods and gadgets. She keeps her post at the threshold between earth and eternity. Her stillness is not indifference. It is faith in our endless curiosity. Every generation must rediscover her, argue with her, measure her, sketch her, love her. And when each has finished, she remains, the unblinking witness to our desire to know who we are. As the sun climbs higher and light fills the desert with another day, the Sphinx once again becomes what she has always been. A mystery written in stone, still watching, still waiting. The face of wonder itself turned eternally toward the dawn.